Can you fight my cousin Bradley? Teased over the rim of his crystal glass. I smiled and said only hand to hand. Knives were optional. He laughed a sharp, condescending sound. Let me guess they called you princess. I looked him dead in the eye and said, Hades. A retired Navy SEAL at the bar dropped his radio. He knew exactly who I was. My name is Jillian. I am 33 years old, and officially, I am a freelance tech support specialist. Unofficially, I am a medically retired Tier 1 intelligence operative. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. Growing up in our family meant understanding a very clear hierarchy. Wealth was the only metric that mattered. My parents, Linda and Richard, worshipped at the altar of financial success. They spent their lives trying to climb the social ladder, always looking for the next rung. When my cousin Bradley made his first million running a hedge fund, he became the undisputed golden child. He could do no wrong. I took a different path. I left home at 18 and spent 8 years studying abroad as far as my family was concerned. In reality, I was deployed in deep cover intelligence operations, completely cut off from the people who viewed my absence as a personal failure. Today was the 4th of July. Bradley was hosting his annual summer barbecue at his sprawling estate in the Hamptons. The property was a monument to excess. It was a massive modern glass structure overlooking the ocean with an infinity pool that seemed to drop right into the Atlantic waves. I drove up the winding driveway in my practical sedan, sticking out among the line of luxury sports cars and imported vehicles. I wore plain khaki pants and a simple gray t-shirt, comfortable clothing that allowed me to move freely. It was a habit born from years of tactical training where restrictive clothing could mean the difference between life and death. As I walked around to the back patio, the sheer scale of the event became clear. Caterers carrying silver trays wove through crowds of elite investors, socialites, and beautiful people wearing designer outfits that cost more than my first car. The air smelled of expensive cologne grilled beef and salty ocean wind. A string quartet played contemporary pop songs near a massive outdoor fireplace. It was an intimidating environment for anyone, but I had spent years infiltrating heavily guarded compounds and active war zones. A Hamptons barbecue barely registered on my radar as a threat. I scanned the perimeter out of habit, noting the security cameras, the exits, and the personnel. That was when I first noticed the security contractor standing near the outdoor bar. He was a large man with a rigid posture and a faint scar running along his jawline. I recognized the stance immediately. He was a military veteran, likely special forces. He was scanning the crowd with the same trained eyes I was using. I made sure to keep my movements casual, blending into the background as I navigated the crowded patio. I spotted my parents immediately. Linda and Richard were hovering near the edge of the infinity pool, hanging on to every word that came out of Bradley's mouth. Bradley stood in the center of a group of wealthy men holding court like a king. He wore a crisp white linen shirt unbuttoned just enough to show off his expensive tan. He held a glass of scotch in one hand and used the other to make sweeping, arrogant gestures as he spoke. He thrived on the attention of his peers and the sycophantic devotion of my parents. I walked over to greet my parents, hoping for a quick, polite hello. Instead, my mother looked me up and down with immediate distaste. She took in my plain t-shirt and sensible shoes and sighed heavily. "Jillian," she said, her voice tight with disapproval, "you could have at least made an effort to dress appropriately. Look at where we are. Everyone here is dressed for a luxury event, and you look like you are about to clean the gutters." My father, Richard, barely glanced at me before turning his attention back to Bradley. "Your mother is right, Jillian," he muttered. "You always manage to embarrass us. Just stand quietly and do not bother anyone." Bradley noticed my arrival, and his eyes lit up with malicious glee. He loved an audience, and I was his favorite target. "Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence," he announced loudly, drawing the attention of the investors around him. "It is my little cousin Jill. How is the computer fixing hobby going, Jill? Are people still paying you to plug in their routers? The group of men chuckled, their expensive watches catching the sunlight as they lifted their drinks. I maintained a neutral expression, keeping my breathing steady. I work as a freelance tech support specialist, I replied calmly. It pays the bills. Bradley smirked and took a sip of his scotch. Barely pays them from what I can see, he countered. Tell me, Jill, did you have to take out a loan just to afford the gas to drive out here today? Gas prices are rough right now. I know a lot of people in your tax bracket are struggling to keep the lights on. More laughter erupted from his circle of sycophants. My mother chimed in, eager to show her allegiance to Bradley and distance herself from her disappointing daughter. We offered to help her find a real job at a corporate firm, but she insists on this freelance nonsense. She lacks ambition, Bradley, just like we always discussed. She simply refuses to apply herself to anything meaningful. I stood there listening to my own mother tear me down to impress her wealthy nephew. In my previous life, I had negotiated with warlords and extracted hostages under heavy enemy fire. I had been trained to suppress my emotional reactions to maintain absolute focus on the mission objective. So I just smiled politely and let them talk. They had no idea that the woman standing before them possessed the skills to dismantle their entire security system in under 10 minutes. They saw a quiet, unassuming woman who fixed computers. They did not see the operative who had survived interrogations that would have broken any man standing in this circle. Bradley was emboldened by my silence. He loved feeling superior, and my lack of reaction only made him push harder. He started telling his friends exaggerated stories about my childhood, painting me as a clueless failure who could never get anything right. He laughed about the time I fell off a bicycle. He mocked my lack of a wealthy husband. He bragged about his own investments, throwing around financial terms to sound important. I recognized some of the terminology he used. It sounded reckless, highly leveraged, and completely unstable. His confidence was a thin veneer hiding a massive ego. But I kept my mouth shut, letting him dig his own grave with his arrogance. The afternoon sun beat down on the patio, and the drinks continued to flow. The security contractor by the bar shifted his position slightly, keeping a watchful eye on the increasingly rowdy guests. I felt his gaze linger on me for a fraction of a second. He was observing my stillness, my lack of fidgeting. He knew I did not fit the profile of a typical guest, but he could not place exactly why. Just then, a drunken guest stumbled backward from the bar area. The man was holding a full glass of red wine, and he was on a direct collision course with me. He was loud and completely lacking any spatial awareness. Before the wine could spill, I stepped smoothly to the side, catching the man by the elbow and shifting his momentum so he regained his balance without spilling a drop. I stabilized him with a firm grip and released him before he even realized he had been falling. It was a minor adjustment executed with fluid precision and complete silence. Bradley watched the interaction from his spot by the pool and smirked. He completely misread the situation, assuming I had merely dodged out of the way in fear. Careful, he joked loudly to the crowd, gesturing at me with his scotch glass. Do not scare her. She might faint. She has always been delicate. He walked a few steps closer to me, his eyes filled with condescension. He wanted to assert his dominance in front of his wealthy peers, to prove that he was the alpha in every room. Tell me the truth, he said, a nasty smile playing on his lips. Can you even fight, Jill? Have you ever actually stood up for yourself in your entire life? I looked at my cousin. I looked at the smug expressions on my parents' faces as they waited for me to shrink away in embarrassment. I looked at the crowd of investors laughing at my expense. Then I smiled, a cold, calculated smile that did not reach my eyes. Only hand to hand, I said, my voice dropping to a calm, deadly pitch that cut clearly through the background noise of the party. Knives were optional. The investors chuckled, thinking I was making a weak attempt at humor. Bradley laughed a sharp, condescending sound. He shook his head, finding the idea of me in combat completely hilarious. He took another sip of his expensive scotch. Let me guess, he teased, lifting his glass toward me in a mocking toast. They called you princess. I did not break eye contact. I let the silence stretch for a long, terrible moment, ensuring that everyone nearby was listening. I looked him dead in the eye and said, Hades. Over at the outdoor bar, the scarred retired Navy SEAL working as private security dropped his radio. The heavy plastic clattered loudly against the stone patio, drawing startled glances from the caterers. His face went completely pale, and the ice in his glass rattled as his hand began to shake. He did not laugh. He did not smirk. He just stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. He knew exactly who I was. The clatter of the radio against the stone patio was sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise of the party. Several heads turned toward the bar, but I kept my gaze locked on Bradley. He was too absorbed in his own amusement to notice the security contractor's reaction. He just shook his head, a condescending smirk plastered across his face. "You always did have an active imagination, Jill." He took another sip of his scotch. "Hand-to-hand combat. Knives. What are you playing too many video games in your mother's basement?" I didn't answer. I just held his gaze, letting the silence stretch until his smirk wavered slightly. He clearly expected me to argue, to defend myself, to provide more ammunition for his mockery. When I offered nothing, he scoffed and turned back to his sycophants. "Let's go inside," he announced to the group of investors. "I have some new acquisitions I want to show you, things that require a slightly higher clearance level than freelance tech support." The men laughed on cue and followed him toward the massive sliding glass doors that led into the house. My parents lingered for a moment. My mother shot me one last look of absolute disgust before hurrying after Bradley, eager to remain in his orbit. My father simply shook his head and followed her. I was left standing alone by the infinity pool. I turned my attention back to the bar. The security contractor was gone. I scanned the immediate area, my training overriding the brief surge of irritation caused by my family. The contractor hadn't panicked. He had retreated. I noted the exits, the catering staff's movements, and the blind spots in the security camera coverage. I needed a drink, preferably water, to maintain my cover as the dull, unremarkable cousin. I walked toward the bar, but before I could reach it, a hand materialized from the shadows near the kitchen entrance. It didn't grab me. It simply gestured for me to step into the alcove. I stepped out of the bright afternoon sun and into the cooler shaded area near the caterer's staging ground. The security contractor was waiting. Up close, the scar on his jawline was more prominent, a jagged white line against deeply tanned skin. He stood tall, his posture rigid, but his hands were open and visible at his sides, a sign of non-aggression. "Commander Thomas Ford," I said quietly, recognizing him now that I had a closer look. He swallowed hard. "You remember me." "I remember everyone I extract, Commander." I kept my voice low, blending with the clatter of plates from the nearby kitchen. "Syria, 5 years ago. Your team was pinned down in a warehouse outside Raqqa. It was supposed to be a simple recon mission," Ford said, his voice barely a rasp. "Intel was bad. We were completely surrounded. We were preparing for a last stand. And then the lights went out," I finished for him. "You took down their entire communications network and local grid in under 3 minutes," Ford said, staring at me as if I were an apparition. "Then you guided us out through their own tunnels. We never even saw you. We only heard your voice on the comms. They told us your call sign was Hades. We thought you were a myth, a ghost story the brass made up to keep morale high." "I'm very real, Commander." I smiled slightly. "And right now I'm just Jillian, the freelance tech support specialist. I'd appreciate it if we kept it that way." Ford nodded slowly, processing the information. "What are you doing here?" he asked, glancing nervously toward the main house where Bradley had disappeared with his guests. "This isn't your scene." "Family obligation?" I replied dryly. "Bradley is my cousin. My parents are rather insistent that I attend these gatherings to marvel at his success." Ford looked genuinely confused. "Your cousin. Bradley is your cousin." "Unfortunately, ma'am." He hesitated, looking around to ensure no one was within earshot. "You need to leave, right now." I raised an eyebrow. "Why is that? Bradley's charming personality getting to be too much?" Ford shook his head. "No, it's not him. It's his guests. I was hired for perimeter security and crowd control. Basic stuff. But I recognized some of the faces he brought in today." "Who are we talking about?" "Victor Thorne, for one," Ford said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He arrived about 20 minutes before you did. He's in the private cabana near the East Wing. My blood ran cold. Victor Thorne wasn't just a wealthy investor. He was a known entity in the intelligence community, a facilitator, a man who moved massive amounts of illicit funds for organizations you didn't want to owe money to. We had tracked his operations across 3 continents, but he always managed to stay one step ahead of the indictments. "Are you absolutely certain it's Thorne?" I asked, my demeanor instantly shifting from cautious relative to active operative. "Positive." Ford nodded. "I ran security details for a defense contractor in Dubai 3 years ago. Thorne was a person of interest. I know his face. And I know the 2 men flanking him aren't just bodyguards, they're heavily armed professionals." I looked toward the main house. Why is a man like Victor Thorne attending a 4th of July barbecue thrown by a mid-level hedge fund manager? "That's the problem," Ford said. "Bradley isn't mid-level anymore. He's been expanding rapidly over the last 6 months, buying up properties, launching new funds. He's trying to play in the big leagues, and Thorne is his ticket in, or his executioner if things go south." "And you think things are going south?" "I think Thorne doesn't attend social gatherings unless he's closing a major deal or collecting a massive debt," Ford said grimly. "And given the amount of security he brought with him, I don't think he's here for the potato salad." I processed this new information. Bradley's arrogance was legendary, but he was always more concerned with appearances than actual substance. If he was involved with someone like Thorne, he was playing a dangerous game, a game that could easily collapse and bring everyone around him down with it, including my parents. "Are there other federal targets here?" I asked. "A few known associates of Thorne's network, money launderers, shell company directors." Ford listed them off. "It's a regular convention of white-collar criminals." I looked back at Ford. "Why are you telling me this? You're on Bradley's payroll." "Because you saved my life and the lives of my men in Syria," Ford said simply. "I owe you a debt I can never repay. And because I know that if Hades is at a party full of federal targets, things are about to get very complicated. I'm telling you to leave so you don't get caught in the crossfire." "I appreciate the warning, Commander," I said, "but I'm afraid leaving isn't an option. Not yet." Ford looked alarmed. "Ma'am, whatever operation you're running, this isn't the place. Thorne's men are heavily armed and they have orders to shoot if they feel threatened." "I'm not running an operation, Ford. I'm attending a family barbecue." I smiled again, a cold, humorless expression. "But I think it's time I had a closer look at my cousin's new acquisitions." I stepped out of the alcove and back into the bright sunlight of the patio. The party was still in full swing. The caterers were circulating with champagne. The string quartet was playing a lively tune. It all looked so perfect, so incredibly curated. But beneath the surface, it was a powder keg waiting to explode. I needed to know exactly what Bradley was involved in. I needed to access his network, and I needed to do it before Thorne decided to close whatever deal he was here for. I walked toward the main house, my posture relaxed, my expression vacant. I was just Jill, the disappointing cousin, wandering aimlessly through a party she didn't belong at. I caught sight of my parents standing near the sliding glass doors, desperately trying to catch the attention of anyone important enough to validate their presence. They looked pathetic, grasping at the coattails of Bradley's manufactured success. I needed to know exactly what Bradley was involved in. I needed a closer look. I walked toward the main house, ready to play my part in this twisted family drama. I stepped into the cool, air-conditioned foyer of the main house. Before my eyes could fully adjust from the bright afternoon sun to the dimmed interior lighting, a heavy hand slammed against the glass door frame right next to my head. I did not flinch. I slowly turned to find Bradley standing uncomfortably close. His face was flushed beneath his expensive tan, and the amber liquid in his crystal glass sloshed dangerously as he gripped it. He had clearly been watching me through the floor-to-ceiling windows, keeping paranoid tabs on his domain. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" Bradley hissed, leaning in, so I could smell the harsh bite of expensive scotch on his breath. "I saw you out there creeping around the catering tents, and then I saw you cornering my security detail. Are you trying to embarrass me on purpose?" I maintained a perfectly neutral expression, tapping into years of training that allowed me to drop my heart rate on command. I was getting a glass of water, Bradley. The contractor simply pointed me in the right direction. Do not lie to me. He snapped, his voice rising sharply enough to draw the immediate attention of a few wealthy guests lingering near the indoor bar. I pay these people a lot of money to protect my assets and my guests. They are elite professionals. They do not have time to entertain my awkward, socially inept cousin who wants to play 20 questions. Stop bothering the hired help. He practically spat the words hired help, completely oblivious to the fact that the man he was insulting was a decorated war hero who could neutralize every threat in this room before Bradley's glass hit the floor. I wasn't bothering anyone, I replied, keeping my tone deadpan and even. We exchanged 2 sentences. If your massive security apparatus is somehow compromised by a brief conversation about hydration, you should probably ask for a refund. Bradley's eyes narrowed into dark, resentful slits. He hated when I didn't cower. He hated when I didn't give him the tearful, defensive reaction he craved to validate his own superiority. He took a step back and raised his voice even further, ensuring that the investors mingling nearby could hear every single word of his impending lecture. You just cannot help yourself, can you, Jill? Bradley announced, projecting his voice across the luxurious room. You come to my house, eat my food, drink my wine, and then you skulk around the edges of the party harassing the staff because you are too intimidated to talk to actual successful people. It is pathetic. The sudden volume of his voice acted like a beacon. Within seconds, the crowd parted and my parents hurried over. Linda and Richard pushed their way to the front, their faces masks of sheer panic and embarrassment. They had spent the entire afternoon carefully curating their image as the beloved aunt and uncle of the Hamptons' newest financial titan. The absolute last thing they wanted was a public scene, especially one involving their deeply disappointing daughter. Bradley, sweetheart. What is going on? My mother asked. Her voice was dripping with a sugary, fawning sweetness she never ever used when speaking to me. She placed a gentle, placating hand on his arm, completely ignoring the fact that he was towering over me aggressively. Your daughter is harassing my security team, Bradley complained, playing the victim with practiced, nauseating ease. I am hosting a very important event here, Aunt Linda. I have highly sensitive investors out there. I cannot have Jill wandering around annoying the guards and making my guests uncomfortable with her bizarre behavior. My father Richard turned to me. The bright, admiring smile he had just offered Bradley instantly vanished, replaced by a scowl of deep, familiar resentment. Jillian, what is wrong with you? My father demanded, his voice a harsh, grating whisper meant to convey absolute authority. We asked you to do one simple thing today. Just stand quietly and be pleasant. Why do you constantly try to ruin things for everyone else? I was getting a drink of water, I stated again, perfectly calm, holding my ground. Bradley is the one raising his voice and causing a scene in front of your friends. Do not talk back to your father, my mother snapped. She stepped forward so she was shoulder to shoulder with Bradley. It was a physical manifestation of their absolute allegiance. They stood united, a solid wall of toxic enablers protecting their golden child from the reality of his own unhinged behavior, completely ready to throw me to the wolves to keep him happy. You are doing it again, Linda continued, her eyes flashing with a cold, performative anger. You are deliberately trying to ruin a beautiful family event because you cannot stand to see someone else shine. You have always done this. Whenever Bradley achieves something wonderful, you have to create a crisis to pull focus. You are just jealous of his massive success. I stared at her, absorbing the sheer absurdity of the accusation. Jealous. Yes, jealous, she repeated loudly, emboldened by the small audience of elites gathering around us to watch the drama unfold. You look at everything he has built, and it eats you alive. Look around you, Jillian. Look at this magnificent estate. Look at these highly successful people. Bradley is managing millions of dollars. He is building a legacy, and you cannot handle the fact that you are falling so far behind. I looked at my mother, then at Bradley, who was smirking triumphantly behind her. I thought about the intercepted financial data currently resting safely on the encrypted drive of my phone in my pocket. I thought about the massive gaping holes in Bradley's fake empire, the plummeting accounts, the desperate money laundering, and the terrifying fact that he had secretly leveraged my parents' entire retirement fund to keep his sinking ship afloat. My mother was standing here viciously defending a man who had already stolen her entire future while aggressively attacking the daughter who was actively trying to figure out how to stop the bleeding. It was a stunning display of delusion, and I felt a cold, hard knot of resolve tighten in my chest. I had spent my entire life biting my tongue to keep the peace in this family. I was entirely done keeping the peace. I assure you, I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady register that carried effortlessly over the quiet room. I am not jealous of Bradley's financial situation, not in the slightest. Bradley scoffed, throwing his head back in exaggerated disbelief. Listen to her. Listen to that tone. She thinks she is better than us. She has always been like this. My father agreed, shaking his head as if I were a tragic lost cause. Always acting so superior, always looking down her nose at real hard work. You fix computer glitches for a living, Jillian. You live in a tiny apartment. Bradley is a visionary. You have absolutely no right to speak to him with that kind of attitude in his own home. She is just bitter, my mother added, feeding off my father's defensive energy. She is bitter because she knows she wasted her potential. We gave her every opportunity to succeed, Bradley. We tried to instill our values in her, but she wanted to do things her own way. And now she is struggling and she wants to bring you down to her level out of pure spite. They were rewriting history right in front of me. They had never given me every opportunity. They had cut me off the moment I refused to fit their perfect corporate mold. They had no idea what I had sacrificed, what I had survived, or what I was truly capable of. To them, I was just a prop that had failed to perform correctly. Lower your voice, Jillian, my mother demanded, despite the fact that I was the only person in the conversation speaking at a normal measured volume. You are making an absolute fool of yourself. Bradley graciously allowed you onto his property today. He generously invited you into his home to share his success and meet important people. The absolute least you can do is show him some basic respect. Respect is earned, I replied, refusing to break eye contact with her. It is not bought with infinity pools, loud parties, and stolen money. Bradley's face went rigid with fury at the comment. The veins in his neck visibly bulged against his crisp linen collar. You ungrateful little nobody. I only invited you because your parents begged me to include you out of pity. My father nodded vigorously, aligning himself completely with my abuser. We did. We practically pleaded with him to let you come, hoping you might finally see what real success looks like and feel inspired to do something with your life. Clearly, that was a massive mistake. You simply cannot stand to be in the presence of someone who outshines you. The united front was impenetrable, a solid wall of delusion and hostility pressing down on me with the weight of 33 years of familial rejection. They had drawn their battle lines, standing firmly on the side of a glittering fraud, setting the stage for a reckoning that would shatter their entire reality. My mother took another step forward, her face contorted into a mask of pure indignation. Why do you always have to seek attention, Jillian? She shouted, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the foyer. It is not enough that you show up looking like a vagrant, but you have to actively try to sabotage the one person in this family who is actually making a name for himself. You disappeared for 8 years studying abroad on some prolonged, ridiculous gap year, while Bradley was here working 90-hour weeks and building an empire from the ground up. She spat the word studying abroad with air quotes and a sneer. That was the story I had given them. The cover identity crafted by my handlers when I was recruited right out of college. My family genuinely believed I had spent my 20s wandering aimlessly through Europe taking useless art history classes and finding myself in cheap hostels because I was too lazy to handle a real corporate job. They thought I was a flake, a drifter, a monumental failure who could not commit to a career path. They did not know about the freezing safe houses in Eastern Europe. They did not know about the 18-hour surveillance shifts tracking human trafficking rings through the darkest corners of the dark web. They had no concept of the interrogations, the extraction operations, or the night I took a grazing bullet to my left shoulder while securing a high-value asset in Damascus. Underneath my plain khaki pants and simple gray shirt, my body was a map of scars earned in silent service to my country. While Bradley was attending cocktail hours and learning how to leverage imaginary money, I was learning how to neutralize armed combatants with improvised weapons. I had been completely cut off from them during those years, unable to call or explain, leaving them to construct their own narrative of my inadequacy. And they had embraced that narrative with terrifying enthusiasm, using my absence as the ultimate proof that I was a failure. "Learn your place," my mother demanded, pointing a trembling manicured finger at my chest. "Your cousin is a titan in this industry. He is hosting billionaires, and you are nothing but a disappointment who cannot even hold down a normal 9 to 5. Bradley crossed his arms over his chest, basking in the glow of my mother's aggressive defense. He looked exactly like a petulant child hiding behind his parents' legs, but he wore the expression of a conquering king. "Aunt Linda is right, Jill," he said, his voice dripping with faux pity. "I tried to include you, I really did. But you are a walking liability. You do not understand how this world works. You do not understand the kind of pressure I am under or the caliber of people I deal with." He gestured grandly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, pointing toward the pristine, manicured lawns of the estate. The timing was impeccable. A sleek black luxury sedan had just pulled up to the private valet entrance, and a tall, imposing man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out, flanked by two massive men with unmistakable tactical posture. It was Victor Thorne, the target. "That man right there," Bradley announced, his voice dropping to a reverent, almost breathless tone. "That is Victor Thorne. He is one of the most powerful private equity investors on the planet. He does not just write checks, Jill. He makes kings. He is my most important investor, and tonight he is officially bringing my fund into the stratosphere. He is my ticket to the Billionaires Club." My father Richard practically vibrated with nervous energy at the mention of Thorne. He turned to me, his face tight with panic and aggressive desperation. He saw my presence not just as an embarrassment, but as a direct threat to the proximity to wealth he so desperately craved. "Do you hear that, Jillian?" my father hissed, stepping directly into my personal space. He lowered his voice, but the venom in his tone was unmistakable. "This is the most important day of Bradley's life. We are talking about generational wealth. We are talking about securing this family's legacy forever. And I will be damned if I let your toxic energy ruin this. I will not let your petty jealousy ruin the vibe for Mr. Thorne." He pointed a stiff finger toward the floor. "You are going to apologize to Bradley, right now. You are going to look him in the eye and apologize for your disruptive behavior. Then you are going to go sit quietly in the back corner of the patio until the caterers start packing up. You will not speak to anyone. You will not touch the expensive liquor. You will stay out of sight." The sheer audacity of the demand hung in the air. My father was looking at me the way one might look at a disobedient dog, expecting me to roll over and expose my belly. He expected me to grovel to a fraud. He expected me to apologize to a man who was actively laundering money for an international criminal syndicate and using his own aunt and uncle as financial meat shields. I looked at my father, taking in his red face and his bulging eyes. I saw a man who had completely surrendered his dignity for the illusion of wealth. I saw a man who would gladly sacrifice his own daughter on the altar of his nephew's ego. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it carried absolute finality. It was not a negotiation. It was a closed door. My father blinked, his mind struggling to process the refusal. "What did you just say?" "I said no," I repeated, keeping my voice completely level. "I am not apologizing to Bradley. I am not going to go sit in a corner, and I am certainly not going to pretend that any of this is normal or acceptable. I have absolutely nothing to be sorry for." My mother gasped, pressing a hand to her chest as if she had been physically struck. "Richard, do you hear her? Do you hear the disrespect? After everything we have done." "What have you done exactly?" I asked, turning my icy gaze to her. "You cut me off when I refused to become a corporate drone. You spent the last decade telling your country club friends I was a lost cause. You have funded this man's ego trip while treating me like dirt on your shoe. So please tell me what exactly I owe you an apology for." You owe us for the embarrassment you bring to this family every single day, my father roared, losing his composure entirely. You owe Bradley an apology for disrespecting him in his own house. You owe us for standing here and acting like you are somehow better than the people who actually built something with their lives. Bradley stepped forward, sensing that his audience of investors was beginning to murmur among themselves. The spectacle was no longer serving his image. It was making his family look unhinged. Uncle Richard let it go, Bradley said, attempting to sound magnanimous. She is clearly having one of her episodes. She is mentally unstable. We always knew she could not handle social situations. Just let security escort her out before Mr. Thorne sees this mess. He is right, my mother agreed quickly, eager to please Bradley. She is ruining the vibe. Get her out of here, Richard, before she does permanent damage to Bradley's reputation. My father reached out and clamped his hand around my upper arm. His grip was bruisingly tight, meant to intimidate and control. You are leaving, Jillian, he growled, attempting to pull me toward the front doors. You are leaving right now and you are never coming back. You are dead to us until you learn how to behave. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. In my world, a hostile grab was an initiation of combat. My muscles twitched, anticipating the strike, calculating the exact angle needed to break his grip and drop him to the floor. It would take less than a second. I could snap his wrist, lock his elbow, and have him completely immobilized before he could even register the pain. But I held back. I let out a slow, controlled breath, forcing my heart rate to remain steady. I was not going to break my father's arm in the foyer of a Hamptons estate. I was going to do something much more devastating. I was going to dismantle the entire foundation of their reality. Let go of me, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm. My father hesitated, his grip loosening slightly at the sheer lack of emotion in my tone. He was used to people reacting with fear or anger. He was not used to absolute cold competence. I smoothly twisted my arm, breaking his grip with a simple rotational maneuver that left him stumbling slightly off balance. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I simply reclaimed my physical space. I am not leaving, I stated firmly, adjusting my plain gray shirt. And I am not apologizing. In fact, I think I am going to go introduce myself to Mr. Thorne. I have a feeling he and I will have a lot to talk about. Bradley's face went completely pale. The smug arrogance vanished instantly, replaced by genuine primal panic. His eyes darted toward the patio where Thorne was currently being greeted by the catering staff. You will do no such thing, Bradley stammered, his voice pitching higher. You are not allowed to speak to him. He is a very important man. You stay away from him, Jill. I mean it. Or what, I challenged, tilting my head. What are you going to do, Bradley? You just fired your best security contractor. Your remaining guards are busy carrying hors d'oeuvres. Who exactly is going to stop me? My parents looked between Bradley and me, completely lost. They could not understand why Bradley was suddenly so panicked. They just saw their disobedient daughter continuing to cause trouble. Jillian, stop this instantly, my mother demanded, grabbing for my arm again. You are acting like a lunatic. You are going to ruin everything. I stepped back, avoiding her grasping hands. The irony of her words was almost poetic. She had no idea how right she was. I was indeed going to ruin everything. But I was not ruining a family gathering. I was demolishing a criminal enterprise. I turned my back on my parents and my sweating, panicked cousin. Without another word, I began walking purposefully toward the sliding glass doors, toward the sunlit patio, and toward the most dangerous man in the Hamptons. The real conflict was just beginning. I had only taken 3 steps toward the sliding glass doors when the sheer panic finally shattered Bradley's carefully manicured facade. He realized in that split second that I was not bluffing. I was actively walking toward the most dangerous man he had ever done business with, and he had absolutely zero leverage to stop me. Security. Bradley shrieked, his voice cracking in a way that completely obliterated his alpha male persona. Security, get in here right now. The hum of conversation in the foyer and the adjacent rooms died instantly. Wealthy investors, socialites, and catered staff all froze, turning their attention to the spectacle unfolding near the patio entrance. My parents, Richard and Linda, stood frozen in shock, their faces drained of color. They had wanted me gone, but they had not wanted a public scene that would make their golden nephew look like a raving lunatic in front of his financial peers. Commander Thomas Ford stepped through the open sliding doors, moving with the silent, predatory grace that only came from years of operating in the deadliest environments on Earth. He had been watching the entire exchange from the patio, holding his position just out of sight, listening to every toxic word my family had thrown at me. The sunlight caught the jagged white scar along his jaw as he entered the air-conditioned foyer, his eyes locked on Bradley. "There you are!" Bradley spat, his face purple with rage. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. "Grab her. Grab her right now and throw her off my property. Drag her out by her hair if you have to. I want her gone before she ruins everything." Ford did not move immediately. He stood there, his rugged face an unreadable mask, his hands resting loosely at his sides. Bradley, furious at the microsecond of hesitation, actually snapped his fingers at the retired Navy SEAL. It was a sharp, disrespectful sound, the exact kind of gesture one might use to summon a disobedient dog. "Did you hear me?" Bradley barked, stepping closer to Ford and puffing out his chest in a laughable display of manufactured dominance. "I pay you an absolute fortune to keep trash out of my house. Do your job and get this woman off my estate." My mother, ever desperate to appease Bradley and maintain her proximity to his wealth, nodded frantically. "Yes, please, officer," she pleaded, using the wrong title entirely, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. "She is trespassing. She is causing a massive disturbance and upsetting the host. Please just physically remove her so we can get back to our celebration. We do not want her here." I watched Ford's jaw clench. In the civilian world, men like Bradley thought their money made them untouchable. They thought they could buy absolute compliance, buy unwavering loyalty, and buy the right to treat lethal professionals like disposable servants. But Ford was not a rent-a-cop hired to stroke a hedge fund manager's ego. He was a Tier 1 operator who had buried brothers in the sand and survived horrors these wealthy socialites could not even fathom. Ford took one slow, deliberate step forward. He did not reach for his radio. He did not reach for the restraints on his tactical belt. He simply crossed his massive arms over his chest, looked Bradley up and down with an expression of absolute, unadulterated contempt, and took a deep, steadying breath. When he spoke, his voice was a booming, authoritative baritone that echoed off the expensive marble floors and commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. "I do not take orders to lay hands on a superior officer." The shockwave that hit the room was physical. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy and suffocating, as if the air had been violently sucked out of the foyer. The wealthy guests exchanged bewildered, panicked glances. My parents stared at Ford with their mouths hanging open, completely incapable of processing the words that had just left his mouth. What Bradley stammered, the words slipping out as a weak, confused breath. He lost his aggressive posture, instantly taking a half step backward. He looked from Ford to me, then back to Ford, his brain misfiring as it tried to comprehend the insubordination. "What are you talking about?" "Superior officer. She fixes computers. She is a freelance nobody who lives in a cheap apartment." "Are you out of your mind?" "I know exactly who she is," Ford replied, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "And I know exactly what she is capable of. I would sooner cut off my own arm than raise a hand against her." My father stepped forward, his face a mask of utter bewilderment. He reached out as if to physically wave away the contractor's words. "There must be some massive mistake here," Richard said, his voice shaking with nervous energy. "You must have her confused with someone else. Jillian is just my daughter. She dropped out of the corporate world years ago. She has absolutely no authority over anyone here. She is nobody." "She has authority over me," Ford stated flatly, not even bothering to look at my father. "And out of respect for that fact, I am suggesting you all step back and give her whatever space she requires." The humiliation of being openly defied in front of his elite peers finally snapped the last remaining thread of Bradley's sanity. His face contorted into a mask of pure infantile rage. He pointed a shaking finger an inch from Ford's broad chest, his voice reaching a hysterical pitch. "You are fired!" Bradley screamed, spittle flying from his lips. You are fired right here, right now. You will not see another dime from me. Pack your gear, take your people, and get off my property before I have the real police arrest you for trespassing. Ford did not flinch. He did not argue. He did not attempt to defend his job or his paycheck. He simply offered a slow, calm nod of acknowledgement. He reached up to his ear, pulled out the sleek, customized earpiece that connected him to Bradley's expensive security network, and let it drop from his fingers. The small piece of plastic hit the marble floor with a sharp crack and shattered beneath Ford's heavy combat boot as he took a deliberate step forward. He did not walk toward the exit. He did not head for the driveway to pack his gear. Instead, Commander Ford took 2 long strides across the foyer and came to a stop directly beside me. He turned his broad shoulders to face Bradley, my parents, and the crowd of stunned investors, forming a physical, impenetrable wall between me and the hostile room. He stood at ease, his hands resting lightly near his belt, transforming instantly from Bradley's hired help into my personal protective detail. I am no longer on your payroll, Ford said to Bradley, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. Which means I am no longer obligated to tolerate your disrespect. I stand with her. I looked up at the scarred veteran standing shoulder to shoulder with me. We had never formally met in the field. I had only been a distorted voice in his earpiece guiding his battered extraction team through a labyrinth of enemy fire half a world away. But the bond forged in that terrifying darkness was stronger than any paycheck Bradley could ever offer. It was a bond built on blood, absolute trust, and survival. Bradley looked at the two of us, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He was completely disarmed. He had tried to use his wealth to physically intimidate me, and instead he had just handed me the most dangerous man on his payroll. The golden child was entirely out of his depth, flailing in a situation his money could not fix, staring at a dynamic he could not buy his way out of. My mother let out a small, terrified whimper, shrinking back behind my father. They looked at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. The daughter they had spent the last hour berating the woman they had labeled a pathetic, jealous failure was now standing side by side with a lethal professional who treated her with absolute, unwavering reverence. Their carefully constructed narrative was crumbling to dust right in front of their eyes, and they had absolutely no idea how to stop it. I did not gloat. I did not offer my parents or my cousin any further explanations. I simply adjusted the collar of my shirt, offered Ford a brief, respectful nod of acknowledgement for his loyalty, and turned my attention back to the patio doors. The delay had cost me a few precious minutes, and Victor Thorne was still out there waiting in his private cabana, oblivious to the fact that his host was currently having a public meltdown. "Shall we, Commander?" I asked quietly, keeping my eyes fixed on the target outside in the brilliant summer sun. "Lead the way," Ma'am Ford replied smoothly, falling into step half a pace behind my right shoulder, ready to walk straight into the fire. The transition from the air-conditioned foyer to the stifling humidity of the Hamptons afternoon felt instantaneous. I walked with absolute purpose, the soles of my practical shoes silent against the imported travertine tiles of the patio. Commander Ford flanked me, his presence a heavy and comforting gravity. The party was still buzzing around us, a symphony of clinking champagne flutes and artificial laughter, the guests completely oblivious to the tectonic shift that had just occurred inside the house. My eyes bypassed the socialites and the junior analysts entirely. My focus was locked on the private cabana, situated at the far end of the infinity pool. There he sat, Victor Thorne. He was holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, smiling politely at an overly eager junior partner who was desperately trying to pitch a business venture. To the untrained eye, Thorne looked like any other silver-haired billionaire gracing the covers of financial magazines. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that breathed luxury, and his posture exuded the relaxed confidence of a man who owned the world. But I did not have an untrained eye. I had the eyes of an intelligence operative who had spent years tracking the digital footprints of his blood-soaked money. I knew the real Victor Thorne. He was a phantom in the global intelligence community, a financial architect for the worst elements humanity had to offer. He did not invest in sustainable energy or commercial real estate. He washed money for cartels, illegal syndicates, and hostile regimes. I had personally traced his shell companies through Cyprus, the Cayman Islands, and Macau. He was the man who turned illicit funds into clean, untraceable assets. The fact that he was sitting casually at my cousin's 4th of July barbecue was not a coincidence. It was a glaring, terrifying red flag. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Bradley was not a financial prodigy. He was not a market genius who had outsmarted Wall Street. He was a useful idiot. Thorne never associated with mid-level fund managers unless he needed a clean, naive front to cycle illicit funds through legitimate American markets. Bradley, with his insatiable ego and desperate need to project wealth, was the perfect patsy. Thorne was using Bradley's flashy new acquisitions and aggressive funds as a giant washing machine. My parents had followed us out of the house, utterly unable to let the confrontation go. They scurried behind us like angry, frantic shadows. "Jillian, stop this erratic behavior right now," my mother hissed. Her voice was a desperate, hushed whisper meant to avoid drawing attention from the other wealthy guests. "You are humiliating us. That man was hired security, and you are acting like he is your personal bodyguard. Turn around, march back into that house, and beg your cousin for forgiveness before he calls the police." I did not even break my stride. Ford subtly shifted his broad shoulders, expanding his physical footprint to block my father from grabbing my arm again. Richard let out an indignant sputter completely out of his depth. "You cannot just ignore us, Jillian," my father demanded, his face flushing crimson with outrage. "We are your parents. We demand respect. This little stunt of yours is going to cost Bradley his biggest investor." I tuned out their frantic gaslighting. They were obsolete variables in an equation that had just turned deadly. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my heavily encrypted phone. It was a modified device stripped of commercial bloatware and loaded with proprietary decryption tools I had helped design during my active deployments. I needed hard evidence. I needed to see exactly what Bradley was showing Thorne to secure this unholy alliance. I kept my pace slow, mimicking the casual stroll of a party guest admiring the ocean view. My thumbs moved with blinding speed across the screen. I pinged the estate's local network. Bradley, in his desperate need to show off his wealth, had wired his entire property into a centralized smart system. The climate control, the outdoor audio, the security cameras, and his private office servers were all sitting on the same wireless architecture. It was an appalling display of amateur cybersecurity. He had likely paid a premium for the installation, but had entirely neglected basic network segregation. I bypassed the guest network instantly. The main administrative firewall was slightly more robust, utilizing a standard commercial-grade encryption protocol. But standard commercial protocols were child's play compared to the hardened military mainframes I was accustomed to cracking. While my mother continued to berate my life choices just 3 feet behind me, complaining about my lack of ambition and my stubborn refusal to wear designer labels, I ran a brute force algorithm masked behind a series of proxy servers. The firewall crumbled in less than 2 minutes. I was in. I had complete, unfettered root access to Bradley's entire digital life. I navigated past the folders containing his mundane personal emails and superficial social calendars, diving straight into the active financial directories. I searched for live data streams, knowing that Thorne's presence meant a demonstration was currently underway. Bradley would be eager to prove his network's capability to process massive volumes of capital. I found it. A hidden encrypted partition was actively transmitting data to an offshore server. I ran a quick decryption sequence, forcing the raw data to render into readable text on my screen. The numbers began cascading down my display, updating in real time. My breath caught in my throat. I was looking at a live ledger of incoming deposits and outgoing wire transfers. The sums were staggering. Millions of dollars were hitting Bradley's accounts from dozens of untraceable shell corporations. But the money did not stay there. It was instantly being fragmented, chopped into thousands of smaller, seemingly innocuous transactions, and routed through a labyrinth of dummy investments before pooling back together in sanitized offshore accounts. It was a classic high-speed tumbling operation. Bradley was actively washing Thorne's dirty money right under the noses of the legitimate investors mingling on his patio. "Jillian, are you even listening to me?" My mother demanded, her voice sharp with toxic entitlement. "Put that phone away. You are being completely antisocial. This is exactly why you have failed at everything you have ever attempted. You lack basic interpersonal skills, and you refuse to act like a normal person." I stared at the cascading numbers on my screen, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the crime unfolding before me. My mother was berating me for lacking interpersonal skills while standing 20 yards away from a man who funded international crime syndicates. The absurdity was almost suffocating. My family was living in a manufactured delusion of status and prestige, completely blind to the fact that they were standing on a trapdoor. I cross-referenced the destination routing numbers against a classified database I still maintained access to. The ping returned an immediate match. The accounts receiving the cleaned funds belonged directly to Victor Thorne's primary syndicate. There was no ambiguity, no room for error. Bradley was fully compromised. He was not just a terrible cousin. He was a federal criminal aiding an international threat. Ford glanced down at my screen. His tactical training allowed him to recognize the structure of a financial intercept, even if he could not read the specific routing numbers. His jaw tightened. He shifted his weight, his eyes sweeping the perimeter with intensified scrutiny. He recognized the shift in the mission parameters. We were no longer dealing with a domestic dispute over a barbecue. We were standing in the middle of a high-stakes criminal enterprise surrounded by hostile actors. I locked the data stream onto my screen, ensuring the live feed would continue to update in real time. I slipped the phone into the palm of my hand, keeping the screen obscured from my parents' line of sight. The time for observation was over. I had the intelligence. I had the proof. Now it was time to deploy it. I set my sights firmly on the private cabana. Victor Thorne was still sipping his sparkling water, looking incredibly bored by the junior partner speaking to him. He was completely unaware that the ghost who had tracked him across the globe was currently walking across the manicured grass of a Hamptons estate, bringing his entire empire straight to his doorstep. I adjusted my posture, letting the final remnants of the disappointing cousin persona fall away. Hades was taking the field. I moved across the pristine lawn with measured, deliberate steps, leaving the frantic chorus of my family behind me. Bradley was practically hyperventilating, his expensive leather shoes slipping audibly on the wet pool deck as he tried to intercept my path. He shouted my name, his voice cracking under the strain of absolute panic, demanding that I stop threatening to have me arrested, threatening to destroy my life. My mother echoed his desperation, her shrill tone cutting through the mellow music of the string quartet playing in the background. She ordered me not to embarrass them in front of the billionaire, screaming that my behavior was the exact reason I was a miserable failure. I did not acknowledge them. They were background noise, irrelevant static, in a highly volatile operational environment. Commander Ford walked in perfect synchronization with me, his massive frame acting as an impenetrable shield against my father's clumsy, desperate attempts to grab my shoulder and pull me backward. The VIP cabana was situated at the far edge of the infinity pool, strategically positioned to offer a commanding view of the ocean, while remaining deliberately isolated from the main party. It was a masterpiece of manufactured exclusivity, draped in sheer white linen and furnished with plush, oversized seating that cost more than most people earned in a decade. To the wealthy socialites mingling nearby, it looked like a glamorous lounge reserved for the elite. To me, it looked like a tactical nightmare. It had only one primary exit, flanked by heavy decorative planters that severely restricted mobility. Two of Thorne's men stood at the periphery trying to blend in as standard private security, but their stance gave them away immediately. They were balanced on the balls of their feet, hands resting casually but purposefully near their waistbands, their eyes scanning the crowd with cold, predatory efficiency. They noticed Ford the second we approached. A silent communication passed between the armed men, a mutual recognition of apex predators entering the same confined space. I stepped under the shade of the cabana awning. The temperature dropped by several degrees, but the tension in the air spiked exponentially. Victor Thorne sat lounging on a pristine white sofa, a picture of relaxed affluence. A junior associate from Bradley's firm was standing in front of him, sweating profusely in his tailored suit, babbling nervously about projected quarterly returns, emerging market synergies, and aggressive portfolio diversification. Thorne was barely listening. His pale blue eyes stared blankly out at the ocean, his expression one of profound, heavy boredom. He was a man who moved billions in illicit capital for the most dangerous organizations on the planet. Listening to a 20-something finance bro pitch a standard mutual fund must have felt like absolute torture. I did not wait for an invitation or a polite break in the conversation. I simply stepped right between the sweating associate and the heavy marble coffee table, cleanly cutting off his line of sight to Thorne. "I think your projections are fundamentally flawed," I said. My voice was smooth, conversational, and entirely devoid of the frantic anxiety that permeated the rest of the party. The junior associate stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in shock at the sudden intrusion. Thorne shifted his gaze from the ocean to me. For a fraction of a second, his eyes registered mild annoyance at being disturbed by a woman in a plain gray t-shirt and khaki pants. He likely assumed I was a confused caterer, a lost relative, or a drunken guest wandering out of bounds. "Excuse me," the associate sputtered, his face flushing crimson with indignation. "We are in the middle of a highly private meeting. You cannot just walk in here. You need to leave immediately before I call security." I ignored the associate entirely, keeping my eyes locked squarely on Thorne. "Your risk assessment model relies entirely too heavily on traditional offshore havens." I continued, leaning casually against the edge of the marble table to establish my physical presence in his space. "But you are completely ignoring the massive vulnerabilities in your localized transit accounts. For instance, relying on an archaic, unsecured routing structure for your primary liquidity is incredibly short-sighted." Thorne's polite, bored facade remained intact, but his posture stiffened just a fraction of an inch. He placed his glass of sparkling water on the table, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. He studied me with a new, sharp intensity. "And who might you be, young lady?" Thorne asked. His voice was a rich, cultured baritone that expertly hid decades of ruthless criminality and violence. "Someone who understands the extreme fragility of a digital ledger?" I replied, offering a polite, businesslike smile that mirrored his own false civility. "Let us take a purely hypothetical scenario. If an investor were moving massive amounts of capital through a shell entity, say using the routing sequence 724, followed by 918, and terminating at 330. That specific transit corridor is currently experiencing severe latency issues. The data packets are entirely exposed. The firewall protecting them is practically non-existent. Any competent analyst could trace that liquidity straight back to the source in a matter of minutes." The numbers I had just spoken were not hypothetical. They were the exact classified routing sequences of Thorne's most secure money laundering pipelines, the very corridors he was currently using Bradley's unsecured network to exploit. These were numbers that only his innermost circle of financial architects and a select few federal intelligence directors knew existed. The transformation in Victor Thorne was instantaneous and terrifying to witness. The cultured, bored billionaire vanished in a heartbeat. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His pale blue eyes widened, the pupils contracting sharply as his highly calculating brain processed the catastrophic breach of his entire criminal empire. He stared at me, his mind racing to calculate how a plain-clothed woman at a Hamptons barbecue had just casually recited the specific coordinates to his heavily guarded financial stronghold. He knew instantly that I was not a caterer. I was not a lost relative. I was a direct, lethal threat that had walked right past his defenses. The silence in the cabana stretched into a suffocating vacuum, heavy with the promise of violence. The junior associate, completely oblivious to the deadly subtext of the conversation, tried to interject again to save his pitch. "I have absolutely no idea what routing numbers you are talking about, but this is highly inappropriate," the associate stammered. Thorne silenced him with a single sharp raise of his hand. His eyes never left mine. He did not shout. He did not make a scene. He was a professional survivor who understood that raising his voice would only draw unwanted attention to a highly compromised position. Instead, Thorn made a microscopic movement with his left hand, a subtle, practiced gesture directed at the two massive men standing at the periphery of the cabana. It was a silent command, a tactical shift from passive observation to active containment. The bodyguards responded with terrifying synchronization. They dropped their facade of casual security instantly. The man on the left, a heavily built operative with the cold eyes of a seasoned mercenary, stepped smoothly across the threshold of the cabana, physically blocking the primary exit. He widened his stance, his right hand moving deliberately to rest flat against his suit jacket, hovering directly over a concealed weapon. The second man mirrored the exact movement on the right flank, stepping forward to cut off any lateral escape route toward the infinity pool. They moved with mechanical precision, executing a kill box maneuver designed to trap a target in a confined space. The geometry of the cabana had fundamentally changed. What was once a luxurious seating area was now a lethal tactical trap. I was boxed in cornered between the heavy marble table, the sprawling white sofa, and two heavily armed men who were waiting for a single nod from Thorn to end my life. Behind me, I could hear Bradley finally reaching the edge of the cabana. His breath was ragged, his voice pitching into a hysterical whine as he realized he had completely lost control of his own party. "Mr. Thorn, I am so sorry," Bradley gasped, practically shoving his own associate out of the way to reach the front. "She is my cousin. She is mentally unwell. She has episodes like this. I am having security remove her right now. Please forgive this interruption." Bradley was entirely oblivious to the fact that the atmosphere in the room had shifted from a social faux pas to a lethal standoff. He reached out intent on grabbing my shoulder to drag me away by force. But Commander Ford moved faster. Ford stepped seamlessly into the narrowing gap between the two advancing bodyguards, his massive frame disrupting their clear line of sight. He did not draw a weapon, but his presence was a physical barricade. He angled his body slightly, protecting my blind spot, while simultaneously establishing a dominant tactical position over Bradley. Thorn's men recognized the shift immediately. They locked eyes with Ford, silently calculating the immense cost of engaging a Tier 1 operator in close quarters. I did not break eye contact with Thorn. The trap was set, the exits were blocked, and the threat of catastrophic violence hovered inches away, but my heart rate remained perfectly steady. I had walked into this cabana fully aware of the tactical disadvantages. I had deliberately triggered the trap to ensure Thorn understood the absolute certainty of his own destruction. As I was saying, I continued, my voice cutting cleanly through Bradley's frantic apologies and the heavy metallic tension of the standoff. The latency issues are fatal. The architecture is entirely compromised. I strongly suggest you reconsider your current operational strategy before the entire network collapses permanently. Thorn stared at me, the muscles in his jaw ticking rapidly as he weighed his options. The plain gray shirt, the sensible shoes, the calm demeanor, he was putting the pieces together, recognizing the unmistakable signature of a ghost operative who had just checkmated him in broad daylight. Bradley's complete inability to read a room was matched only by his staggering arrogance. He did not see the lethal standoff between Commander Ford and Victor Thorn's heavily armed security detail. He did not recognize the microscopic shifts in posture that indicated highly trained men preparing for a gunfight. In Bradley's narrow, money-obsessed mind, the only crisis occurring was a social one. He saw his disappointing, impoverished cousin, speaking out of turn, to his billionaire ticket to the elite class, and his fragile ego demanded immediate physical correction. He lunged forward, shoving his own sweating junior associate out of the path, his face a mottled mask of crimson fury. He reached out with a heavy manicured hand and clamped his fingers down hard on my left bicep. It was an aggressive, punishing grip, the kind of grab designed to inflict pain and assert absolute patriarchal dominance. He intended to physically drag me out of the cabana, fully expecting me to stumble backward in tears and submission, just as I had always done when we were children. The moment his fingers dug into my flesh, the civilian world evaporated. 33 years of family conditioning vanished instantly, overridden by a decade of deep-cover tactical survival training. Muscle memory forged in the blood and dust of hostile territories took absolute control. I did not think. I simply reacted to a hostile physical threat entering my immediate perimeter. My response was not angry or emotional. It was a fluid surgical application of extreme violence. Before Bradley could even inhale his next breath to shout at me, the entire geometry of his world inverted. I dropped my center of gravity, pivoting sharply on my right heel to slip inside his aggressive stance. With my free right hand, I trapped his wrist against my body, locking his joint in place so he could not retract his arm. Simultaneously, my left hand shot upward in a devastatingly precise strike, catching him directly under the tricep and forcing his arm into a rigid, hyperextended lever. The shock on his face had not even begun to register before I executed the takedown. I swept my left leg in a brutal sweeping arc behind his knees, completely severing his base of support. Bradley weighed nearly 200 pounds, a solid mass of gym-built muscle and expensive steak dinners. But leverage and kinetic energy rendered his size entirely irrelevant. He went airborne. His feet flew out from under him, and his torso plummeted downward with the uncontrolled velocity of a falling stone. I guided his descent with absolute precision, steering his body away from Thorn and directly toward the massive, thick, tempered glass of the cabana's custom coffee table. Bradley hit the glass face down with a sickening, bone-rattling thud that echoed like a gunshot across the patio. The heavy table shuddered under the impact, the crystal glasses tipping and spilling sparkling water across the transparent surface. I did not release him. I followed his momentum downward, driving my left knee sharply into the small of his back to pin his spine flat against the glass. I maintained my iron grip on his extended right arm, twisting his wrist and pulling his arm upward into an excruciating shoulder lock. I locked the joint exactly 1 millimeter away from the absolute breaking point. A single twitch, a single ounce of added pressure, and his rotator cuff would tear, his shoulder would dislocate, and the bone would snap under the torque. Bradley let out a high-pitched, strangled shriek of absolute agony. It was a sound completely devoid of dignity, the raw, unfiltered scream of a bully, experiencing true physical dominance for the first time in his pampered life. He flailed his free arm, his expensive leather shoes scrambling desperately against the imported patio tiles, but he was entirely trapped, immobilized by a woman half his size. The immediate aftermath was a tableau of absolute chaos. The cheerful pop music from the string quartet halted in a discordant screech of bows against strings. The ambient chatter of the barbecue vanished, replaced by the sound of shattering glass as wealthy guests dropped their champagne flutes in sheer terror. Across the patio, my mother let out a blood-curdling hysterical scream. She pushed through the crowd, her hands flying to her face in abject horror, unable to comprehend the visual reality of her golden nephew pinned like a helpless animal beneath my knee. My father shouted for the police, his voice cracking in panic as he tried to surge forward, only to freeze when he realized he had absolutely no idea how to physically intervene. The elite investors, the socialites, the people who had mocked me just 10 minutes prior, were now backing away rapidly, their eyes wide with fear as they stared at the monster that had just materialized in their midst. Inside the cabana, the real players remained motionless. Thorne's 2 heavily armed bodyguards had twitched instinctively at the sudden movement, their hands gripping the handles of their concealed weapons. But they did not draw. Commander Ford had shifted his stance the microsecond I moved, angling his massive frame to perfectly block their line of fire. Ford did not look at Bradley. He kept his cold, dead eyes locked squarely on Thorne's men, a silent promise that if they pulled a trigger, they would die before their weapons cleared their holsters. Victor Thorne remained seated on the pristine white sofa, completely untouched by the violence that had just erupted inches from his knees. He looked down at Bradley's mashed, sweating face, pressed against the glass, and then he looked up at me. Thorne raised a single calm hand, a silent command to his bodyguards to stand down. He recognized the display for what it was. It was not a bar fight. It was a demonstration of absolute, lethal competence. I had neutralized a hostile threat in under 2 seconds, without breaking my gaze from the primary target. Beneath my knee, Bradley was hyperventilating, his chest heaving against the hard glass. "Get off me!" he sobbed, the tears mingling with the spilled sparkling water on the table. "You are breaking my arm. Get off me, you crazy lunatic. I will sue you. I will have you locked up for the rest of your life. I am going to destroy you." He thrashed his hips in a pathetic attempt to dislodge my weight, a fundamental mistake in close-quarters combat. I responded by shifting my hips and applying a fraction of an ounce of upward torque to his trapped wrist. The joint popped audibly and Bradley let out another piercing wail, his body going completely rigid as the white-hot pain paralyzed his nervous system. My mother reached the edge of the cabana, her face streaked with mascara as she shrieked my name. "Jillian, let him go. Right now," Linda screamed, her hands waving frantically in the air. "Are you out of your mind? You are breaking his arm. Somebody help him. Someone call the authorities." She took a step toward the marble table, fully intending to physically pull me off her precious nephew, but Commander Ford simply extended one massive arm, blocking her path with the immovable force of a concrete wall. My mother crashed into his forearm and bounced off, entirely incapable of breaching the perimeter. I leaned down, bringing my face mere inches from Bradley's ear. I did not shout. I did not raise my voice to match his hysteria or my mother's deafening screams. I spoke in a calm, soothing whisper that cut right through his blind panic. "Do not move, Bradley," I advised him softly. "The human shoulder is an incredibly fragile mechanism. The supraspinatus tendon is currently stretched to its absolute maximum tolerance. If you struggle, if you attempt to buck your hips again, that tendon will tear. The humerus bone will separate from the socket, and you will require months of painful reconstructive surgery just to hold a cup of coffee. Do you understand the physics of your current situation?" Bradley choked on a sob, a string of drool hanging from his lip and pooling on the expensive glass. "Please," he whimpered, the arrogant titan of finance reduced to a begging, terrified child. "Please, Jill, it hurts. Stop it. Please stop it. You do not understand the rules of this world." "Bradley," I continued, whispering into his ear, ensuring that only he and Thorne could hear the precise nature of my threat. "You think money makes you untouchable. You think playing host to international criminals makes you powerful. But you are just a civilian playing dress-up in a war zone you do not comprehend. You put your hands on a trained operative. You are incredibly lucky I only intend to break your ego today and not your neck." I kept him pinned, letting the absolute humiliation of the moment saturate his brain. He was lying face down in front of his billionaire savior, in front of his sycophantic aunt and uncle, in front of the entire Hamptons elite. His carefully manufactured kingdom had been violently ripped away, exposing the weak, frightened fraud underneath. The illusion of his golden child superiority was dead shattered on the tempered glass beneath him. I looked up from his weeping face and met Victor Thorne's calculating blue eyes. I held Bradley's arm locked in place, my breathing perfectly even, demonstrating to the money launderer that the master of this estate was nothing more than a minor, easily neutralized distraction. I released the torque on Bradley's wrist with a fluid, deliberate motion. I did not shove him or throw him. I simply removed the calculated pressure that had been holding his entire world together. Without my knee pinning his spine to the glass, gravity and sheer exhaustion took immediate effect. Bradley slithered off the marble coffee table, his expensive linen shirt soaked in spilled sparkling water and his own cold sweat. He crumpled onto the pristine patio tiles, cradling his right arm against his chest like an injured infant. He gasped for air, letting out pathetic wet sobs that completely destroyed any remaining illusion of his dominance. I stepped back, smoothing the front of my plain gray shirt, my breathing completely even. My mother finally breached the invisible barrier of shock. She shrieked, a high and piercing sound that sliced through the heavy, humid air of the Hamptons afternoon. She threw herself onto the ground next to Bradley, wrapping her arms around his shaking shoulders. her designer dress soaking up the puddles of spilled water. "You are a monster," Linda screamed, tilting her head back to glare at me with absolute unfiltered hatred. "You are a violent, jealous psychopath. You come into his home and attack him like a wild animal." My father, emboldened by my mother's hysterics and my sudden lack of physical aggression, stepped forward. His face was a mask of rigid, pulsating fury. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out his phone, his hands trembling so violently he could barely unlock the screen. "I am calling the police!" "Jillian," Richard bellowed, ensuring that the ring of stunned investors and socialites could hear his declaration of law and order. "I am pressing felony assault charges. You are going to prison for this. I will make sure you are locked in a cell where you belong. You do not ever lay hands on this family." I did not flinch. I did not take a defensive step backward. I looked directly at my father and offered a cold, razor-sharp smile. "Call them," I challenged, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. "Dial the number right now, Richard. Tell the dispatcher exactly where we are. Give them the address of this magnificent estate. Tell them you need an immediate tactical response because your nephew is currently hosting Victor Thorne." My father froze, his thumb hovering over the screen of his phone. He did not know who Victor Thorne was, but he could hear the absolute lethal certainty in my voice. He could see the way the wealthy investors standing at the periphery of the cabana suddenly shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting toward the exits. Richard looked at Bradley, who was currently curled in a fetal position on the wet tiles, whimpering and refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The golden child was shattered, and my father's conviction began to waver. "Do it," I commanded, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "Call the authorities. Because the police, the FBI, and the Securities and Exchange Commission are exactly who need to be standing on this patio right now. They are going to be incredibly interested in what is running through the servers hidden in the basement of this house. Since you seem hesitant to make the call, let me save you the trouble of explaining the situation to them." I reached into my pocket and retrieved my heavily encrypted device. Across the far end of the infinity pool, serving as the ultimate centerpiece for Bradley's extravagant barbecue, sat a massive custom-built outdoor entertainment screen. For the past 3 hours, it had been looping a sleek, high-definition slideshow of Bradley ringing stock exchange bells, posing on yachts, and shaking hands with minor politicians. It was a digital monument to his manufactured ego. I tapped into the administrative back door I had breached just minutes prior. I bypassed the audio-visual routing protocols with 3 rapid commands. The transition was violent and immediate. The string quartet playing near the outdoor fireplace had already stopped, but the ambient house music pumping through the estate's hidden surround sound speakers cut out with a sharp, ear-splitting screech of digital feedback. Guests clutched their ears, wincing at the sudden abrasive noise. Then absolute silence descended upon the party, the kind of heavy, expectant silence that precedes a devastating storm. The massive LED screen across the pool flickered. The slideshow of Bradley's glorious achievements vanished, replaced by the stark, glaring contrast of an unfiltered terminal window. The screen went black, then flared to life with columns of cascading data, banking ledgers, and raw financial analytics. The font was large, crisp, and entirely undeniable. I mirrored my phone's display directly onto the 100-inch monitor, broadcasting the intercepted data stream to every single billionaire, socialite, and family member present on the property. I turned my back to the screen, facing the crowd, acting as the narrator for Bradley's total annihilation. "I want everyone here to take a very close look at the screen," I announced, my voice carrying effortlessly across the water of the infinity pool. "What you are seeing is not a projection of future earnings. It is not a pitch deck for a new venture capital fund. You are looking at a live, real-time mirror of Bradley's primary, secondary, and offshore financial accounts. You are looking at the absolute truth." The crowd turned their attention to the glowing LED display. The numbers scrolling across the screen were glaringly, violently red. I highlighted the summary row at the bottom of the master ledger, magnifying the digits so that even the guests standing by the driveway could read them. The negative balances were staggering. They were not just missing a few investment targets. The accounts were hemorrhaging capital at a rate that defied standard economic logic. Bradley is not a billionaire, I stated, pacing slowly along the edge of the cabana. He is not a financial titan. He does not own this estate. He does not own the cars in the driveway, and he certainly does not own the liquid assets he has been using to solicit your investments today. Bradley is completely, irrevocably bankrupt. He is operating at a deficit of over $80 million. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of elite guests. Men in tailored suits pulled out their phones, frantically calling their brokers to freeze their portfolios. Women covered their mouths in shock. The socialites who had fawned over Bradley all afternoon now looked at him as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. The pristine illusion of the Hamptons barbecue had been stripped away, leaving only the ugly, rotting core of a massive financial fraud. The funds he currently holds do not belong to him. I continued, my voice echoing over the rising panic of the crowd. They are being actively funneled through a network of unsecured shell companies designed to wash illicit capital for international criminal organizations. You are all standing at ground zero of a federal money laundering operation. My parents remained frozen on the patio tiles next to Bradley's sobbing form. They stared at the massive screen, their eyes wide and uncomprehending. The numbers were too large, the deficit too deep for their minds to immediately process. Linda clutched Bradley's ruined linen shirt, shaking him gently, as if trying to wake him from a nightmare. "Bradley," she whispered, her voice trembling with rising panic. "Bradley, tell them she is lying. Tell them this is a trick. Tell them it is a fake screen." Bradley could not answer. He just buried his face in his hands, letting out a long, agonizing moan that confirmed everything I had just revealed. He lacked the strength to formulate a lie, stripped entirely of his defense mechanisms by the physical pain in his shoulder and the digital exposure of his crimes. He was a hollow shell, a boy who had played a dangerous game and lost everything in a matter of minutes. I looked down at my mother, watching the denial battle, the terrifying reality settling into her bones. She looked from the red numbers on the screen back to her golden nephew, the life she had idolized, turning to ash in her hands. "I wanted you to call the police, Richard," I reminded my father, who was still clutching his phone in a white-knuckled grip. "I wanted you to invite the authorities onto this property so they could see exactly what your golden nephew has been doing behind closed doors. So please make the call. Let us see how quickly Bradley's friends run for the gates when the federal agents arrive to audit those bleeding red accounts. Let us see how much this family legacy is really worth." The crowd of investors and socialites did not wait for my father to make the call. The sheer mention of federal audits, money laundering, and illicit offshore accounts sent them scrambling like rats exposed to sudden light. Panic rippled across the manicured lawn as women kicked off their designer heels to run faster, and men shoved each other out of the way to reach the valet stand. The exodus was immediate, brutal, and entirely devoid of loyalty. Within moments, the edges of the patio cleared completely, leaving only the core players trapped in the blast radius of Bradley's imploding life. I did not watch the guests flee. My eyes remained locked on my parents, waiting for the exact moment the final pillar of their manufactured reality crumbled into dust. I tapped the screen of my encrypted device one more time, swiping past the master ledger to open a heavily guarded secondary directory. The massive outdoor display flickered, zooming in on a single neatly formatted spreadsheet. The red glow of the negative balances reflected ominously across the surface of the infinity pool. "You see, Richard?" I said, projecting my voice so it rang clearly over the sound of retreating cars and revving engines. A Ponzi scheme of this staggering magnitude requires a constant, massive influx of fresh capital just to keep the illusion afloat. When the market turns, the margin calls hit with devastating speed. And Bradley did not have the liquidity to cover those calls. He needed collateral. He needed physical assets he could leverage quietly, without triggering alarm bells in his primary criminal syndicate. I highlighted a specific column on the screen, illuminating a block of text in glaring white against the dark terminal background. Take a very close look at the names listed on those asset transfer forms. Read the account numbers. Look at the routing histories. I want you to see exactly what your blind devotion has purchased. My father squinted at the massive screen, his brow furrowing as he tried to decipher the dense financial jargon that he had always pretended to understand. My mother, still kneeling beside Bradley on the wet tiles, slowly lifted her head. I watched her lips move silently as she read the text projected 50 feet away. The names on the screen were Linda and Richard. Next to their names were the exact routing numbers for their joint retirement accounts, their mutual funds, and the liquid cash reserves they had spent 4 decades meticulously accumulating. Below that was a digitized, notarized copy of the deed to their home. The very same home where they had raised me, the home where they had proudly hung framed photos of Bradley's college graduation while hiding my art projects away in dusty shoeboxes. The home they had continually threatened to kick me out of was now entirely owned by a shadow bank. "What is this?" my father asked, his voice suddenly sounding thin and reedy, stripped of all its former aggressive patriarchal bluster. "Why are our names on his margin account documents?" "Bradley, what is she showing us?" I did not give Bradley the chance to formulate a pathetic weeping excuse. "He leveraged you," I stated plainly, delivering the fatal blow with surgical precision. "He ran out of his own money 6 months ago. When the creditors started knocking, he panicked. He took the power of attorney you so foolishly granted him to manage your portfolio, and he drained every single cent you owned. Your retirement fund is gone. Your life savings are completely wiped out. He used your house as collateral to secure a high-risk short-term loan from an unregulated lender. And he lost that money within 72 hours. You have absolutely nothing left." My mother let out a sound that barely registered as human. It was a hollow, scraping gasp of absolute primal terror. She grabbed Bradley by the collar of his ruined, wet linen shirt, shaking him with frantic, jerky movements that completely ignored his broken wrist. "Bradley, look at me!" she demanded, her voice cracking into a hysterical screech. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me this is just another one of her jealous tricks to ruin your big day. Tell me our money is safe." Bradley could not look at her. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, tears streaming down his bruised face, his body trembling violently against the cold patio tiles. He offered no defense. He offered no comfort. His silence was the loudest, most devastating confession possible. He had fed them to the wolves to buy himself a few more months of pretending to be a titan. My father's phone slipped from his trembling hand, clattering against the stone deck and cracking the screen. His knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto a nearby lounge chair, his chest heaving as the catastrophic reality crashed down upon him. He was completely, irrevocably destitute. The wealth he had worshipped, the high society status he had sacrificed his own daughter to maintain, had been vaporized by the very nephew he had placed on a golden pedestal. They were worse than bankrupt. They were tied to a federal crime scene, and they did not even have the funds to hire a defense attorney. I stood before them, feeling no pity, no remorse, and no desire to offer comfort. The well of my compassion for these people had run completely dry a decade ago. "You cut me off when I was 22 years old," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through my mother's hysterical sobbing. "You threw me out of the house with a single suitcase because I dropped out of a degree program you forced me into. I begged you for help. I asked you for basic living expenses just so I could eat while I tried to fix my mental health. You told me I was a failure. You told me I was a waste of resources. You said I lacked the discipline to handle adult responsibilities." I gestured sharply toward the whimpering broken man lying on the ground between them. "But you handed this fraud the keys to your entire existence. You blindly signed over your life savings because he wore a nice suit, drove a car he did not actually own, and promised to invite you to parties like this. You funded his fake millionaire lifestyle while your own daughter slept on couches and worked 3 jobs just to survive. You wanted proximity to power so badly that you willingly marched right off a cliff for him. You dug this grave with your own greed, and now you get to lie in it." My mother looked up at me, her face smeared with expensive makeup, her eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic pleading. She released Bradley's shirt and crawled a few inches toward me on her knees. "Jillian, please," she choked out, reaching a shaking hand toward my sensible shoes. "You have to fix this. You understand computers. You understand this digital money stuff. You have to reverse the transfers. We are your parents. You cannot let us lose our home. You cannot let us end up on the street with nothing. You have to save us." The sheer audacity of her request was breathtaking. Even now, stripped of all her leverage, her immediate instinct was to command me to fix a mess I did not create. "I cannot reverse a margin call, Linda," I replied deliberately, refusing to use her maternal title. "The money is gone. It was fed into a digital shredder and dispersed to cover debts that Bradley could not pay. Your home currently belongs to a shadow bank that will initiate foreclosure proceedings the moment the markets open on Monday morning. You are officially broke. I am not going to save you. I am not going to bail you out. I am going to stand right here and watch you experience the exact same abandonment you inflicted on me." Commander Ford remained rooted to his spot beside me, his eyes constantly scanning the cabana. The domestic drama unfolding on the patio was devastating to my family, but it was entirely secondary to the actual tactical threat in the room. Victor Thorne had not moved from his white sofa. He had watched the entire revelation with the cold, detached gaze of an apex predator assessing a shift in the wind. He did not care about my parents' retirement fund. He did not care about Bradley's bruised ego or my family's shattered delusions. Thorne cared about one thing only, and that was the highly public exposure of his illicit money laundering pipeline. Thorne slowly set his glass down on the marble table. The sound was sharp, drawing my immediate attention away from my weeping mother. The financial data scrolling on the massive screen behind me was undeniable proof that his capital had been compromised. I had not just exposed Bradley. I had actively tracked Thorne's money. I had proven that I possessed the exact routing numbers, the localized transit accounts, and the digital keys to his underground empire. I had made him vulnerable in broad daylight, surrounded by civilian witnesses and a highly trained military operator. He realized that his entire operation was bleeding out on a 100-inch monitor for the world to see. The atmosphere on this patio instantly shifted from a family tragedy to mortal danger. The ambient noise of the crashing waves and the distant hum of traffic faded into the background, replaced by the heavy metallic silence of impending violence. My parents, completely consumed by their financial devastation, remained utterly oblivious to the silent communication passing between Thorne and his armed bodyguards. They did not notice the way the two massive men subtly shifted their weight, their hands sliding beneath their tailored jackets to grip the handles of their concealed firearms. They did not understand that their crying, pleading, and begging were entirely useless in this arena. The rules of engagement had changed. We were no longer dealing with a social dispute. We were standing in a kill zone. Thorne stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and utterly devoid of panic. He brushed an invisible speck of dust from the lapel of his bespoke charcoal suit, smoothing the fabric with manicured fingers. The mask of the bored billionaire dissolved completely, revealing the cold reptilian gaze of a cartel architect who had ordered the executions of hundreds without losing a moment of sleep. He did not look at my parents, who were still frozen in their financial despair. He did not look at Bradley, who was currently weeping into the puddles of sparkling water on the patio tiles. Thorne looked only at me, his pale blue eyes assessing the exact level of threat I represented to his global empire. "You are an exceptionally bold woman," Thorne said. His rich baritone voice no longer held any trace of polite civility. It was flat, mechanical, and heavy with the promise of immediate violence. "You have bypassed commercial firewalls, intercepted classified routing sequences, and projected my private liquidity across a 100-inch monitor. It is a brilliant display of technical espionage. But it is also a fatal miscalculation. You assumed that bringing my operation into the light would act as a shield. You assumed that public exposure would force me to retreat. Thorn took a single step out of the cabana, the sleek leather of his shoes silent against the stone deck. He gestured casually toward the glowing LED screen across the infinity pool, where the red numbers of his money-laundering pipeline continued to cascade in real time. You do not understand the mechanics of my business. Thorn continued, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper that carried perfectly over the quiet patio. I do not fear exposure, because exposure is a temporary problem. Problems can be erased. Witnesses can be silenced. Digital records can be corrupted or destroyed. You have not trapped me. You have simply forced me to accelerate my timeline and eliminate a localized nuisance. Thorn raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. It was the exact same gesture Bradley had used to summon Commander Ford earlier, but this time the command carried the weight of absolute death. The two massive bodyguards flanking the cabana moved with terrifying speed. The man on the left drew a suppressed tactical handgun from beneath his jacket, raising the barrel with clinical precision. The man on the right mirrored the action, the dull metal of his weapon glinting in the afternoon sun. They did not aim at my legs. They did not aim at the ground to intimidate. They aimed directly at my center of mass, their fingers resting lightly on the triggers, waiting for the final nod from their employer to end my life. The sight of drawn, suppressed firearms instantly shattered the remaining delusions of my family. The reality of their financial ruin was abruptly, violently eclipsed by the immediate biological terror of a firing squad. My mother let out a strangled, breathless squeak. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, her expensive dress tearing against the rough edges of the patio stones. She collided with the base of a heavy ceramic planter, curling her body into a tight, trembling ball. My father dropped to the ground beside her, covering his head with his arms, his mouth opening in a silent scream of pure panic. They finally understood that this was not a social disagreement. This was not a corporate negotiation. They had blindly wandered into a den of wolves, and they were about to be slaughtered simply for being in the room. Bradley, lying broken on the tiles, pushed himself up on his good arm. Blood and saliva dripped from his chin. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted wildly between Thorn and the suppressed weapons. He did not try to shield his aunt and uncle. He did not try to protect me. He did what a coward always does when faced with the consequences of his own hubris. He groveled. "Mr. Thorn, please," Bradley sobbed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I had nothing to do with this. She is crazy. She hacked my servers without my permission. I am loyal to you. I can fix the accounts. I can get you more money. Just take her phone. Take her. Shoot her. Do whatever you want. Just please do not kill me. I beg of you. I will do anything you want to." Bradley's betrayal was absolute and instantaneous. He was literally offering my life to a criminal syndicate in exchange for his own skin. He lay there in a puddle of his own making, a ruined, sniveling fraud offering up his cousin to an executioner. Thorn did not even blink at Bradley's pathetic display. He looked at the sniveling hedge fund manager with an expression of profound disgust. "You are a liability," Bradley Thorn said coldly. "A loud, incompetent liability who allowed a freelance technician to breach a billion-dollar transit corridor. You have exhausted your usefulness." Thorn turned his attention back to me, extending an open palm. "Hand over the phone," he demanded. "Hand over the device, provide the encryption keys to terminate the broadcast, and I will ensure your death is quick. Refuse, and my men will take the device from your corpse after they shoot your parents, your pathetic cousin, and the security contractor standing beside you." I did not hand over the phone. I did not step backward. My heart rate remained perfectly steady, beating a calm, rhythmic tempo in my chest. The adrenaline in my bloodstream was not the chaotic, blinding rush of panic that consumed my family. It was a cold, hyper-focused chemical clarity that honed my senses to a razor-sharp edge. I registered the exact distance between myself and the nearest gunman. 12 feet. Too far to close the gap before he could pull the trigger. I registered the trajectory of the barrel, the angle of the sun, and the slight shift in the shooter's weight. I also registered the movement beside me. Commander Ford did not hesitate. He did not retreat to save himself. The retired Navy SEAL stepped fully out of the shadows, moving with the fluid, synchronized grace of a man who had fought in 100 different combat zones. He bypassed my cowering parents and positioned himself directly in the line of fire. He did not draw a weapon. He did not need to. His body was the weapon. Ford pivoted smoothly, aligning his broad back squarely against mine. The physical contact was immediate and grounding. We stood back to back, forming a tight, impenetrable tactical circle. It was a classic combat formation, a silent agreement executed without a single spoken word. I covered the front, keeping my eyes locked on Thorne and the gunman to the right. Ford covered our 6 o'clock, his massive frame shielding our blind spots and neutralizing the gunman to the left. We were two veterans of the Shadow Wars operating on pure muscle memory and absolute mutual trust. I felt the steady rhythmic rise and fall of Ford's breathing against my spine. He was perfectly calm. There was no fear in his posture, only lethal readiness. We were outnumbered and outgunned, surrounded by hostile mercenaries on a billionaire's patio, but we were in our element. "You are making a mistake," Thorne said, his voice tightening with a fraction of irritation as he observed our defensive formation. "You are a technician and a retired security guard. My men are active contractors. They do not miss. You cannot fight your way out of this." I tightened my grip on my encrypted phone, holding it up so Thorne could see the screen. "I am not a technician, Victor," I stated, using his first name to strip away the last remnants of his artificial authority, "and I do not need to fight my way out of anything. You think this device is just a mirrored screen? You think you can take this phone, shoot us, and wipe the servers clean? You are operating on outdated intelligence." I tapped the side of the device with my thumb. "This phone is equipped with a biometric deadman switch. It is constantly monitoring my pulse, my body temperature, and my grip pressure. The data packet currently broadcasting your money laundering operation to that outdoor screen is also sitting on a delayed relay server. If my pulse stops, if this phone leaves my hand, or if you attempt to force me to unlock it, that server will instantly transmit your entire digital ledger to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, the FBI, and Interpol simultaneously." Thorne's eyes narrowed. He scrutinized my face, searching for any sign of a bluff. He found none. I had stared down interrogators who utilized much worse than suppressed pistols. I possessed a level of psychological endurance that Thorne could not intimidate. "You shoot me," I continued, my voice echoing over the quiet patio, "and you pull the trigger on your own empire. Every safe house, every routing number, every offshore dummy corporation will be flagged and frozen before my body hits the ground. Your clients will be exposed. The cartels you wash money for will know that you allowed a massive security breach due to your own negligence. They will not wait for a federal indictment to hold you accountable. They will hunt you down and slaughter you themselves." The two bodyguards hesitated. The unwavering certainty in my voice caused a ripple of doubt to crack their professional discipline. They looked toward Thorne, their weapons remaining raised, but their trigger fingers freezing. They were mercenaries paid to eliminate threats, but they were not suicidal. They understood that killing me meant triggering a catastrophic data dump that would likely result in their own eventual executions by angry cartel bosses. The silence stretching across the patio was agonizing, punctuated only by the ragged, desperate gasps of my mother trying to pull air into her panic-constricted lungs. Richard was curled tightly into himself, his expensive suit stained with dirt and spilled water. A broken man who had chased status until it led him to the barrel of a gun. They were witnessing the catastrophic collapse of their universe. The country club dinners, the designer clothes, the bragging rights about their golden nephew, all of it had evaporated, replaced by the terrifying certainty that their lives were entirely meaningless to the men holding the weapons. The mercenary on my right adjusted his grip on his suppressed pistol. He was a professional. His breathing controlled, his eyes devoid of any human empathy. He wore a dark tailored suit that failed to hide the bulk of a tactical vest underneath. His stance was textbook, designed for maximum stability and rapid target acquisition. I catalogued his micro-movements, noting the slight tension in his forearm. He was waiting for Thorne to call my bluff. He was ready to pull the trigger the second he received the authorization, completely unconcerned with the collateral damage of my cowering parents or the weeping hedge fund manager on the floor. I felt Ford's shoulder press firmly against mine. The physical contact was an anchor in the storm of impending violence. Ford was not just a security contractor. He was a warrior who had survived the worst theaters of combat on the planet. His presence radiated a calm, lethal energy. I knew without looking that his eyes were tracking the mercenary on the left, calculating the exact trajectory required to disarm him if Thorne gave the kill order. We did not need a verbal strategy. We shared a tactical language forged in the crucible of military service. We were a unified front, two ghosts standing against an empire of dirty money. Thorne's pale eyes remained fixed on my phone. He was a man accustomed to absolute control, a billionaire who orchestrated global financial shifts with a wave of his hand. But standing in the cabana, stripped of his digital secrecy, he was exposed. The realization that he had been outmaneuvered by a woman he had dismissed as irrelevant was visibly eating at him. He hated the vulnerability. He hated the fact that his life, his empire, and his freedom were currently resting in the palm of my hand, tethered to a biometric switch he could not hack or bribe his way past. "You are playing a dangerous game," Thorne whispered, the venom in his voice finally bleeding through the cultured facade. "You have no idea the forces you are meddling with." "I know exactly what forces I am meddling with," I replied smoothly. "I have hunted your associates through the digital shadows for years. I know the shell companies. I know the offshore accounts. I know the blood on the ledgers. You are a parasite, Victor, feeding on the greed of arrogant fools like my cousin. But your feast is over." Bradley let out another pathetic wail at the sound of his name, burying his face deeper into his arms. He was utterly broken, a hollow shell of a man who had sacrificed his own family to feed his insatiable ego. He had sold out his parents, stolen their retirement, and laundered criminal funds just to play pretend in the Hamptons, and now he was nothing more than a stain on his own patio. The standoff held a terrifying equilibrium of lethal force and digital deterrence. The mercenaries weighted their fingers, resting on their triggers. Thorne calculated his dwindling options. Ford and I stood back to back, an impenetrable fortress of combat experience and unyielding resolve. We were ready for whatever came next, bracing for the inevitable explosion of violence, holding the line as the clock ticked down to 0. The countdown in my head reached 0. The heavy metallic silence that had suffocated the cabana was suddenly shattered by a low, rhythmic vibration. It did not start as a sound, but as a deep tremor that radiated through the imported stone tiles beneath my feet and resonated in the marrow of my bones. The two mercenaries flanking Victor Thorne felt it too. Their eyes darted upward, their strict combat discipline breaking for a fraction of a second, as the vibration rapidly escalated into a deafening mechanical roar. I did not look up. I simply glanced down at the tactical watch strapped to my left wrist. The digital display blinked a steady, synchronized green pulse. I had triggered a silent, encrypted federal distress beacon the exact moment I recognized Thorne at the barbecue. The beacon contained a highly compressed data burst carrying my operational authorization codes, GPS coordinates, and the priority designation of the target. I knew the federal response time protocols for a Tier 1 asset reporting an international fugitive. The cavalry was precisely on schedule. A massive twin-engine tactical helicopter crested the tree line of the estate, swooping in dangerously low from the direction of the Atlantic Ocean. It was a matte black bird, stripped of all commercial markings, a predator moving with terrifying speed and precision. The sheer acoustic force of the rotors hitting the humid summer air was deafening. The helicopter flared its nose backward, killing its forward momentum and coming to a hovering halt directly above the infinity pool. The resulting rotor wash was catastrophic for Bradley's carefully curated luxury event. Hurricane-force winds slammed into the patio, instantly transforming the glamorous setting into a chaotic debris field. The sheer white linen curtains of Thorne's VIP cabana were violently ripped from their tracks, whipping through the air like tattered flags. Heavy crystal glassware, expensive bottles of imported liquor, and silver platters of catered food were swept off the tables and hurled across the deck. The massive outdoor entertainment screen, which was still broadcasting the damning evidence of Bradley's shattered Ponzi scheme, violently shook on its reinforced mounts. The wind caught the patio furniture, lifting heavy wicker chairs and glass tables and tossing them effortlessly into the churning waters of the infinity pool. Water sprayed everywhere, blinding the remaining combatants and soaking the deck. Thorne's bodyguards instantly lost their tactical advantage. The blinding spray of chlorinated water and the deafening roar of the helicopter completely disoriented them. They stumbled backward, raising their free arms to shield their faces from the flying debris. Commander Ford did not flinch. He used the cover of the violent rotor wash to smoothly step forward, closing the distance between himself and the mercenary on the right. Ford moved with the brutal efficiency of a man completely unbothered by chaos. He struck the mercenary's wrist with a pinpoint bone-shattering blow, dislodging the suppressed pistol before the man could even register the counterattack. The weapon clattered onto the wet stones, and Ford immediately kicked it away into the deep end of the pool. Simultaneously, the ground assault began. The heavy, unmistakable crunch of reinforced steel colliding with wrought iron echoed from the front of the estate. Bradley had spent a small fortune on a custom-designed electronically coded front gate to keep the commoners out. The incoming tactical units did not bother asking for the passcode. 3 armored black Federal SUVs acting as a battering ram simply drove straight through the iron barricade, ripping the heavy metal doors entirely off their hinges. The vehicles tore up the long manicured driveway, their tires tearing deep muddy gashes into the pristine landscaping that Bradley obsessed over. They slammed to a halt at the edge of the back patio, forming a hard tactical blockade that sealed off any potential escape route toward the street. The doors of the SUVs flew open in perfect synchronization. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents wearing black tactical gear and Kevlar vests poured out, executing a textbook perimeter breach. They moved like a single unified organism, their assault rifles raised and locked onto their targets. "Federal agents, drop your weapons, get on the ground!" The commands were bellowed through amplified megaphones, cutting cleanly through the fading roar of the helicopter as it ascended to circle the perimeter. Red laser sights cut through the mist of the rotor wash, painting the chests of Thorne's remaining bodyguards. The mercenaries were hardened criminals, but they were also pragmatists. They looked at the red dots illuminating their hearts, looked at the dozen assault rifles pointed directly at their heads, and realized that any twitch of resistance would result in their immediate execution. They dropped their remaining weapons, raised their hands high in the air, and slowly sank to their knees on the soaked patio tiles. Victor Thorne remained seated on the white sofa, though his expensive suit was now thoroughly soaked by the pool water. He did not attempt to run. He did not shout for his lawyers. He simply stared at the swarm of federal agents dismantling his private security force in a matter of seconds. He looked back at me, his pale blue eyes reflecting the profound, bitter realization of his absolute defeat. He had spent his entire life building an untraceable empire, layering his operations behind walls of corporate anonymity and lethal force. And it had all been torn down in an afternoon by a ghost he severely underestimated. Thorne slowly laced his fingers together and placed his hands on top of his head, offering a quiet, cynical surrender to the inevitable. While Thorne accepted his fate with cold calculation, Bradley shattered completely. The golden child, still nursing his severely hyperextended arm on the ground, looked up to see men in tactical gear swarming his prized property. In his frantic, deeply narcissistic mind, he realized that the federal agents were not just here for Thorne. They were here for the man operating the server, washing the money. They were here for him. Blind, animalistic panic overrode Bradley's physical pain. He scrambled up from the wet glass and slippery tiles, his expensive linen shirt clinging to his back. He did not run toward his aunt and uncle to protect them. He did not try to explain his actions to the authorities. He simply abandoned everyone and tried to save his own skin. Bradley turned and broke into a pathetic, desperate sprint toward the private beach access stairs at the far edge of the infinity pool, wildly hoping to disappear into the sand dunes. He made it exactly 10 feet. A federal agent heavily armored and sprinting with the explosive power of a professional athlete intercepted Bradley's escape path. The agent did not bother shouting a command to halt. He simply launched himself horizontally through the air, executing a flawless, brutal, open-field tackle. The agent's shoulder impacted Bradley's midsection with the force of a freight train. The breath was violently expelled from Bradley's lungs in a loud, wet wheeze as his feet left the ground entirely. The momentum carried both men over the decorative edge of the patio. They crashed spectacularly into the deep end of the infinity pool, sending a massive plume of water cascading over the negative edge. The splash was enormous, a deeply humiliating end to Bradley's grand escape. Seconds later, Bradley surfaced coughing up chlorinated water and thrashing wildly in panic. The federal agent, completely unbothered by the water, hauled Bradley to the shallow end by the collar of his ruined shirt. The agent forcefully shoved Bradley face first against the submerged steps of the pool, yanking his arms behind his back and securing his wrists with heavy-duty plastic zip ties. Bradley wailed a high, reedy sound of utter defeat as he was dragged out of his own pool like a drowned rat, shivering and bound in front of his ruined estate. My parents, Linda and Richard, remained exactly where they had fallen when the weapons were first drawn. They were huddled together at the base of the ceramic planter, soaked to the bone, trembling uncontrollably. They watched through wide, terrified eyes as the federal tactical teams systematically secured the area. They watched their golden nephew, the man they had practically worshipped, get hauled out of the water in zip ties, weeping uncontrollably, while an agent read him his Miranda rights. Their entire universe had collapsed into a chaotic, terrifying crime scene, and they possessed absolutely no mental framework to process the destruction. With the hostiles neutralized and the perimeter locked down, the chaotic energy of the raid quickly transitioned into the cold, methodical efficiency of a secured federal crime scene. Agents moved purposefully, securing evidence, cataloging the discarded weapons, and establishing a command post in Bradley's lavish outdoor kitchen. The lead federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man, wearing a tactical vest with the letters FBIHRT emblazoned across the back in stark yellow lettering, separated himself from the main assault team. He walked purposefully through the wreckage of the Hamptons barbecue. He stepped over a shattered crystal vase, bypassed a soggy tray of imported caviar, and completely ignored Victor Thorne, who was currently being handcuffed, and read his rights by two junior agents. The lead agent did not look at my cowering parents. He did not spare a single glance for Bradley, who was currently sobbing on the pool deck. He marched in a perfectly straight line directly toward the cabana, where Commander Ford and I were standing. Ford took a half-step back, lowering his defensive posture and standing at a relaxed state of attention, recognizing the authority of the approaching officer. I remained perfectly still, my encrypted phone resting securely in the palm of my hand. The lead agent came to a halt exactly 3 feet in front of me. He planted his boots firmly on the wet stones, squared his broad shoulders, and snapped his right hand up to his brow, offering me a crisp, textbook military salute. He held the salute, his expression conveying absolute professional respect for a superior operative. "Site is secure, ma'am," the agent stated, his deep voice carrying clearly over the sounds of the running SUV engines and the distant fading chop of the helicopter blades. "The data packet you transmitted was spot on. We have the primary target in custody, and Cyber Division is currently seizing the servers in the basement. Your operation was flawless." The manicured grounds of the Hamptons estate, which had been a glittering symbol of manufactured wealth just an hour ago, were now a chaotic federal crime scene. The flashing red and blue lights of tactical vehicles strobed against the fading afternoon sun, casting harsh shadows across the patio. Agents in windbreakers systematically cataloged evidence, securing Bradley's laptops, encrypting his servers, and bagging the discarded weapons of Thorne's neutralized security detail. I stood near the edge of the cabana, Commander Ford still a silent, solid presence at my side. We watched as Bradley was hauled upright from the shallow end of his infinity pool. He was a pathetic, dripping mess. The crisp white linen shirt he had worn like armor was plastered to his shivering torso, stained with dirt and chlorinated water. His right arm hung at an awkward, painful angle from where I had immobilized him, and his wrists were secured tightly behind his back with thick plastic zip ties. He was not acting like a titan of finance. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he sobbed uncontrollably, the water and snot mingling on his bruised face. As two heavily armored agents dragged him toward a waiting black SUV, Bradley caught sight of my parents huddled near the ceramic planters. His sheer, desperate narcissism overrode his panic, and he shrieked at them. "Aunt Linda!" Uncle Richard, Bradley wailed, his voice cracking horribly. "Do not let them take me. You have to call the lawyers. You have to post bail. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. Please, you have to help me. I am your nephew. You have to fix this." My parents did not move to help him. They could not. They were entirely paralyzed, their bodies locked in a state of absolute, profound shock. They had spent decades building their entire identity around proximity to Bradley's wealth, eagerly adopting his arrogance and cruelty as their own. And now they were watching their golden idol being dragged away like a common street criminal, shrieking for a rescue they could not provide. Before Bradley could scream their names again, the agent shoved him forcefully into the back of the SUV and slammed the heavy door shut instantly, cutting off the sound of his pathetic pleading. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle peeled out of the ruined driveway, taking the golden child away to a federal holding cell. My parents remained frozen on the patio tiles, staring blankly at the empty space where the SUV had been. Their delusion was breaking, but the full reality of their situation had not yet entirely crushed them. That moment arrived precisely 30 seconds later, delivered by a senior financial crimes investigator. The investigator, a woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard, approached Linda and Richard. She did not offer a polite greeting. She did not soften her tone for the wealthy socialites. She treated them exactly like what they were, complicit parties in a massive federal fraud investigation. Linda and Richard Vance, the investigator, asked, confirming their identities with a quick glance at her notes. My father nodded slowly, his face ashen. "Yes, what is going on? Where are they taking Bradley? We are his family. We demand to know what the charges are." The investigator looked at him with profound professional exhaustion. Bradley Vance is currently being transported to a federal detention facility. He is facing multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering in connection with an international criminal syndicate. And frankly, Mr. Vance, his location is the absolute least of your immediate problems. My mother found her voice, though it was nothing more than a trembling, high-pitched squeak. Our problems. We have not done anything wrong. We are victims here. Bradley managed our accounts, but we had absolutely no idea he was doing anything illegal. You cannot hold us responsible for his actions. We are respectable people. The investigator flipped a page on her clipboard. Ignorance is not a legal defense against asset seizure, Mrs. Vance. According to the preliminary data packet we intercepted, you and your husband granted Bradley Vance full unmitigated power of attorney over your entire financial portfolio. Yes, my father interrupted, desperation coloring his tone. Because he is a hedge fund manager. He was getting us incredible returns. But those are our accounts. Our names are on them. Not anymore, the investigator stated flatly. The data shows that 6 months ago, Bradley Vance leveraged your entire portfolio, your pensions, your mutual funds, your liquid cash reserves, and the deed to your primary residence to cover massive shortfalls in his illegal margin accounts. He transferred those assets into a shell company controlled by Victor Thorne. My mother's hands flew to her mouth. She shook her head violently, refusing to process the words. No, that is impossible. He would not do that. He loves us. He promised us those investments were completely secure. He showed us the statements just last week. The statements were fabricated. The investigator replied, her voice entirely devoid of pity. The money is gone. The assets were utilized to fund a criminal enterprise and have subsequently been seized by the federal government under civil asset forfeiture laws. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your credit lines are terminated. And your primary residence is currently being cordoned off by federal agents for a full forensic audit. You are officially entirely bankrupt. I suggest you contact a public defender immediately. The investigator turned on her heel and walked away, leaving my parents standing in the wreckage of their manufactured lives. The silence that fell over them was absolute. It was the sound of a universe collapsing. My father sank back onto the wet lounge chair, his face buried in his hands, letting out a single devastating sob. My mother simply stared at the ground, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently at her sides. They had sacrificed everything for the illusion of wealth. They had alienated their own daughter, criticized my life, and demanded my silence to appease a man who had been secretly robbing them blind. They had willingly walked onto the gallows and handed the executioner the rope. And then, in a display of staggering, unbelievable audacity, they turned to me. Linda and Richard slowly lifted their heads, their eyes locking onto me, where I stood with Commander Ford. The sheer terror in their expressions morphed instantly into a frantic, grasping desperation. The daughter they had spent the entire afternoon trying to throw off the property, the woman they had labeled a pathetic, jealous failure, was suddenly their only remaining lifeline. They saw the federal agents treating me with respect. They saw the lethal security contractor standing guard at my shoulder. They realized far too late that I wielded the exact kind of power they desperately needed to survive. My mother scrambled up from the patio tiles, her expensive dress ruined and clinging to her legs. She stumbled toward me, her arms outstretched, her face twisted in an expression of pleading agony. "Jillian." Linda sobbed, the tears streaking her makeup. "Jillian, please, you have to help us. You heard what she said. They are taking everything. They are taking the house. We have no money. We have nothing. You have to fix this." My father stood up quickly, rushing over to join her. He reached out as if to grab my arm again, but Ford simply shifted his stance, dropping his hand to rest casually near his tactical belt. The silent threat was unmistakable, and Richard froze, dropping his hands to his sides. "Jillian, you work for the government," my father pleaded, his voice cracking. "You obviously have high-level clearance. You know these people. You have to talk to them. Tell them we are innocent. Tell them we had absolutely no idea what Bradley was doing. You have to make them unfreeze our accounts. You have to get our house back. We are your family. You cannot just stand there and let this happen to us." I looked at the two people who had raised me. The two people who had spent my entire life making me feel like a burden and a disappointment. I looked at the tears streaming down their faces, and I felt absolutely nothing. The well of familial obligation, the desperate need for their approval, had run completely dry. There was no anger left, only cold, sterile clarity. "You want me to use my clearance to bail you out?" I asked, my voice perfectly level, carrying cleanly over the sound of the idling federal vehicles. "Yes," my mother cried, nodding frantically. "Yes, please. We will do anything. We are so sorry for what we said earlier. We were just stressed. We were just trying to protect Bradley because we thought he was succeeding. We did not know he was a criminal. Please, Jillian, we are your parents. You owe us this." I did not flinch. I did not soften my expression. I looked at them with absolute ice. "I owe you nothing." I stated, the words falling like heavy stones onto the patio. "I owed you my loyalty and you threw it away. I owed you my respect and you demanded I give it to a fraud. I owed you my presence and you told me I was a failure because I did not fit your incredibly shallow definition of success." My father took a desperate step forward. "Jillian, please, we were wrong, we admit it. We were completely wrong about Bradley. But we are blood. You cannot let your own flesh and blood end up homeless. We have nowhere else to go. You have to take us in until this is sorted out. You have to protect us." I tilted my head, studying their panicked, pathetic faces. "You did not want a daughter, Richard," I said quietly, ensuring every word landed with devastating precision. "You wanted a prop. You wanted an accessory you could parade around the country club to make yourselves look good. When I refused to play that part, when I chose a life of actual service instead of corporate greed, you cut me off. You told everyone I was a lost cause. You stood on this exact patio 20 minutes ago and demanded I apologize to the man who was actively destroying your future." "Jillian, we did not know." My mother sobbed, reaching out a trembling hand. We did not know what he was doing. You did not care what he was doing. I corrected her, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. You only cared that he was rich. You idolized his wealth so much that you willingly handed him the keys to your entire existence. You chose him over me every single time, and now you get to share his legacy. My parents stared at me, the finality of my words suffocating the last remaining embers of their hope. They realized in that terrifying moment that I was not bluffing. I was not going to negotiate. I was not going to save them. The daughter they had thrown away had returned as a ghost, and the ghost had absolutely no mercy to offer. You are going to lose the house, I continued, outlining their future with clinical detachment. The federal government will seize the property. The banks will liquidate your remaining assets to cover the margin calls Bradley defaulted on. You will be forced to move into a cheap apartment, and you will likely have to find minimum wage jobs just to afford groceries because your pensions are permanently gone. And you will do all of it without a single dime of support from me. You cannot do this to us, my father whispered, tears finally breaking and sliding down his cheeks. You are our daughter. You are supposed to love us. I let out a slow, controlled breath, feeling the last remaining ties to my childhood sever completely. I am Hades, I replied coldly, and I do not negotiate with casualties. The lead agent, his face impassive beneath his tactical helmet, reached into a secure pouch on his vest and withdrew a ruggedized military-grade tablet. He activated the screen with a biometric scan and handed it to me. The display did not show financial ledgers or compromised routing numbers. It showed a highly classified federal authorization form, heavily redacted but clear in its intent. This confirms the completion of Operation Cerberus, the agent stated, his voice a low, steady hum amidst the chaotic backdrop of the crime scene. Your intelligence packet provided the critical infrastructure mapping required to dismantle Thorne's localized network. As per your operational contract, the federal bounty for securing the primary target and providing actionable financial intercepts has been authorized. I scanned the digital document, my eyes skipping over the legal jargon and landing on the final, unredacted figure at the bottom of the screen. The number was astronomical. It was a massive multi-million-dollar payout, a federal reward for neutralizing one of the most prolific money launderers on the eastern seaboard. It was not inherited wealth. It was not stolen capital. It was compensation earned through years of lethal, invisible service. The funds will be routed directly into your secure offshore accounts within the hour, the agent confirmed, noting my slight nod of acknowledgement. We have also scrubbed your presence from the tactical logs of this specific raid. Officially, you were never here. The operation will be attributed to a joint task force initiative. Excellent, I replied, my voice perfectly steady. I tapped my signature onto the digital screen, permanently finalizing the transaction and officially concluding my involvement with Victor Thorne Bradley and the smoldering wreckage of my family's financial delusion. I handed the tablet back to the agent. He secured the device, offered one final respectful nod, and immediately pivoted back toward the command post, his focus entirely consumed by the logistics of the ongoing raid. My parents, Linda and Richard, had watched the interaction with the desperate, panicked intensity of drowning victims spotting a life raft. They did not understand the specifics of the conversation, but they recognized the transaction of power. They saw the federal agent deferring to me, treating me not as a suspect or a civilian, but as an authority figure. In their terrified, shattered minds, they believed this confirmed their only remaining hope. They believed I possessed the influence required to reverse their catastrophic reality. Jillian, my father gasped, scrambling up from the patio tiles, his expensive shoes slipping on the spilled water. Jillian, you see? You have authority here. You just signed something for them. Tell them to give us our accounts back. Tell them we are innocent victims in this. We are your blood. You have to use your position to save us from this nightmare. My mother followed him, her mascara smeared across her pale, terrified face. Please, she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. Please, sweetheart. We will do anything. We will move you into the estate. We will buy you whatever you want. We will introduce you to Bradley's friends. We can be a real family now. Just please do not let them take our home. You cannot be this cruel." I looked at them, observing the frantic, grasping desperation that had completely consumed their entire identities. They were still attempting to bargain with currency that no longer existed. They were offering me a place in a kingdom that had just been vaporized, utilizing the same toxic, manipulative tactics they had weaponized against me for 33 years. "I am not going to intervene," I stated, my voice echoing over the rhythmic thumping of the circling helicopter. "I am not going to call a federal judge. I am not going to petition the Treasury Department on your behalf. I am going to walk off this patio, and I am going to leave you exactly where you put yourselves." "You cannot do this," my mother shrieked, clutching the lapels of her ruined designer dress. "We are your parents. You owe us your life. You owe us respect." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, forcing them to look directly into the cold, dead eyes of the operative they had created. "I owed you loyalty," I replied, my voice dropping to a terrifying, lethal whisper. "And you threw it away because I did not wear the right clothes or attend the right parties. You wanted a prop to make you look successful next to Bradley. You wanted an accessory, not a daughter. And now you get to share his legacy. You get to be the collateral damage of his massive, pathetic ego." I turned away from them, effectively erasing them from my operational perimeter. I walked across the ruined patio, my boots crunching over shattered crystal and expensive hors d'oeuvres. Commander Ford fell into step beside me, his massive frame radiating silent, deadly support. At the edge of the driveway, the tactical teams were currently loading Bradley into the back of a heavily armored transport vehicle. He was completely broken, sobbing hysterically as an agent shoved his head down to clear the doorframe. Bradley twisted his bruised, terrified face toward the patio, his eyes locking onto me one final time. He opened his mouth, likely to beg or threaten or unleash another pathetic string of insults, but the heavy steel door slammed shut before he could utter a single syllable, cutting off his voice forever. I did not pause. I walked toward a sleek black government-issued SUV that had been positioned near the exit, separate from the primary assault vehicles. It was my extraction transport arranged by the tactical command. Ford stepped ahead of me, his large hand grasping the handle of the heavy armored door. He pulled it open, gesturing for me to enter the climate-controlled interior. I reached into the pocket of my practical, durable pants and retrieved my cheap, faded canvas jacket. I slipped it over my shoulders, the familiar weight of the fabric a comforting reminder of my true identity, a stark contrast to the ruined designer suits and soaked silk dresses littering the patio behind me. As I placed my hand on the frame of the SUV, my mother let out one final agonizing scream. It cut through the noise of the federal raid, a desperate, feral sound of absolute ruin. "How can you be so heartless?" Linda wailed, her voice carrying across the manicured lawn. "How can you just walk away and let your own family die in the gutter? You are a monster." I paused at the door of the tactical vehicle. I did not turn fully around. I simply looked back over my shoulder, my gaze sweeping over the flashing police lights, the armed federal agents, and the shattered, cowering enablers who had spent my entire life trying to destroy my spirit. I offered them one last cold, utterly detached smile. "I am just a princess," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the humid summer air. "And Hades does not do bailouts." I climbed into the back of the armored SUV, the heavy door slamming shut behind me with a solid, satisfying thud. The tinted windows instantly severed my connection to the Hamptons estate, plunging the interior into cool, quiet darkness. Commander Ford slid into the driver's seat, his massive hands gripping the steering wheel. He did not ask for directions. He did not offer any superficial commentary on the catastrophic destruction of my biological family. He simply engaged the engine and accelerated smoothly down the driveway, bypassing the chaotic swarm of federal vehicles and exiting the property without looking back. The story of the Hamptons barbecue concluded in the harsh, unforgiving light of federal courtrooms and bankruptcy hearings. Bradley Vance did not secure a plea deal. The sheer magnitude of his financial crimes, coupled with his direct involvement in an international money laundering syndicate, resulted in a swift and brutal prosecution. He was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary stripped of his assets, his reputation, and his manufactured ego. My parents, Linda and Richard, faced the absolute reality of their blind, toxic devotion. The federal government seized their home, liquidated their remaining assets, and froze their pensions to cover a fraction of the debts Bradley had incurred in their names. They were forced to vacate their prestigious neighborhood and relocate to a cramped budget apartment in a less desirable zip code. Stripped of their wealth, they discovered that their country club friends and socialite acquaintances wanted absolutely nothing to do with them. They were forced to take minimum-wage retail jobs just to afford basic groceries, their days consumed by the humiliating reality of living the life they had always mocked. I did not attend Bradley's sentencing. I did not monitor my parents' eviction proceedings. I used my substantial federal reward to secure a sprawling, highly fortified property outside of the city. I officially launched an elite private cybersecurity firm utilizing my specialized tactical experience to protect high-value targets and dismantle complex digital threats. I built my own empire entirely on my own terms, surrounded by a team of fiercely loyal, lethal professionals who understood the true meaning of brotherhood and sacrifice. I was no longer the disappointing daughter. I was no longer the invisible cousin. I was the architect of my own survival, living peacefully and successfully, perfectly content in the knowledge that those who had tried to break me were currently drowning in the devastating consequences of their own insatiable greed. Would you like to explore how we can adapt this structure for a different protagonist's profession? Or perhaps focus on a specific type of family betrayal for the next outline? The greatest lesson I learned from the ashes of that Hamptons barbecue wasn't about tactical superiority or digital warfare. It was about the true definition of worth and the necessity of absolute boundaries. For years, my family measured my value through the distorted lens of superficial wealth and corporate prestige. They looked at my plain clothes and quiet life and saw a failure completely blind to the strength and resilience it took to survive battles they couldn't even fathom. They chose a glittering fraud over genuine connection, trading their morality for proximity to power. The reality is that you cannot force people to see your value if they are deeply committed to misunderstanding you. When the people who are supposed to protect and love you choose to belittle you to elevate their own egos, your response should not be to shrink, apologize, or explain yourself. Your response must be to build a fortress of your own making. True power doesn't come from a tailored suit, an infinity pool, or the approval of toxic enablers. It comes from owning your narrative, trusting your own competence, and knowing exactly when to walk away. Sometimes the most profound act of self-care is simply stepping back and letting the natural consequences of people's arrogance catch up to them. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep manipulative people warm. Share your own experiences of setting hard boundaries with toxic relatives in the comments below. If my journey from being the disappointing cousin to reclaiming my peace and walking away resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of survival strength and ultimate justice. Remember, your worth is never determined by someone else's inability to see it.